The smell of jet fuel never really leaves you. Margaret Peg Calloway had noticed that years ago. It clung to flight suits, to memories, to the particular way a body tenses the moment turbines spool up nearby. Standing near the entrance gate of Naval Air Station Miramar on a bright California morning, cane in hand, silver hair pulled back in a simple knot, she felt the old familiar tightening in her chest. 67 years old, civilian clothes. Nobody's pilot anymore, at least not officially. But the moment the distant sound of FA-18 engines rolled across the tarmac, every cell in her body remembered exactly who she was. She had not come to take photographs. She had come to remember. The airshow crowds pressed around her, families with sticky-fingered children, veterans in weathered caps, teenagers already bored and scrolling their phones. Peg moved through them like a ghost. Older women often become invisible in public spaces. She had learned to use that invisibility strategically, the way she had once used cloud cover. Her left hand gripped a faded Navy baseball cap, the insignia of VFA 81 Sunliners, barely legible after decades of handling. Her right hand held her cane more firmly than strictly necessary. Habit. Control over small things when the larger world refused to bend. Civilians always thought it was about speed. They never understood that combat flying was about precision under pressure, making correct decisions with insufficient information, while your body was being crushed by forces it was never designed to endure. Keeping your mind working when every cell screamed for oxygen and darkness crept in at the edges of your vision. At 67, Peg no longer commanded the immediate respect she once had. Her clothes were civilian plain, khaki slacks, a navy blue blouse, practical shoes. Nothing that would draw attention. Nothing that would reveal that she had once pulled 9GS in the cockpit of an FA-18 Hornet over hostile territory. Nothing that would tell strangers she had been among the first women to fly combat missions for the United States Navy. But Peg still carried herself like someone accustomed to authority. Despite the slight limp from an old injury, her posture remained military straight, shoulders squared, chin level. The VIP line moved quickly. Peg stepped up to the table where two young volunteers checked credentials. "Good morning, ma'am," said the male volunteer, barely looking up from his tablet. "ID and invitation, please." Peg produced her driver's license and cleared her throat. "I don't have an invitation. I was hoping there might be space in the veterans section. I served with VFA 81. The young man glanced up, taking in her civilian appearance with a quick, dismissive sweep. "The veteran seating is for military ID holders only, I'm afraid." Peg reached into her pocket and produced a military ID, so old its lamination had begun to yellow at the edges. The young man studied it with obvious skepticism. "This is expired, ma'am," he said, handing it back. "We need current ID for the VIP section." "Of course it's expired," Peg replied, her voice level but firm. "I retired in 2005, but I flew with the Sunliners during Desert Storm." The female volunteer looked up with marginally more interest. "You were a nurse with the Navy." Peg felt something inside her harden. After all these years, it still happened. The automatic assumption, the mental demotion. "No," she said quietly. "I was a pilot, FA-18 Hornets." The volunteers exchanged glances, skepticism evident in the micro-expressions Peg had learned to recognize decades ago when she first entered flight school. The slight raise of eyebrows, the almost imperceptible tightening at the corners of mouths. Disbelief dressed as politeness. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the male volunteer said, clearly not sorry at all. "Without current military ID or a special invitation, I can only direct you to the general seating." Peg nodded once sharply. She should have called ahead, pulled strings, used what few connections she still maintained. Pride had prevented her. The same pride that now made her straighten her shoulders as she turned away from the VIP entrance. The general viewing area is actually better for photography, the female volunteer called after her, offering what she probably thought was a consolation. Peg didn't turn back. Behind her, she heard a burst of teenage laughter. "Dude, did you hear that? The old lady thinks she flew fighter jets. Maybe she's confusing Top Gun with real life. My grandma does that too. Last week she told me she was at Woodstock when she's never left Ohio." More laughter. Peg kept walking, eyes forward, her grip on her cane tightening until her knuckles whitened. She found a spot along the fence line, away from the main crowds but with a clear view of the runway. Perfect visibility with minimal social interaction. A tactical position, as she had once been trained to think. Old habits. In 90 minutes, the FA-18 Super Hornets would take to the sky. Peg had timed her arrival precisely. Some things you never forget how to calculate: distance, time, fuel consumption, optimal positioning. The mathematics of survival that had once been as natural to her as breathing. She removed a small pair of binoculars from her purse and trained them on the distant flight line. The newer Super Hornets gleamed in the sun, their sleek profiles both familiar and foreign to her eyes. So much had changed since her time in the cockpit. New avionics, enhanced thrust vectoring, improved radar systems. Yet the essentials remained the same. A human being strapped into an ejection seat, controlling a machine that could kill them in a heartbeat if respect and concentration lapsed for even a moment. The unforgiving physics of flight. These things never changed. For a moment, Peg allowed herself to remember how it felt. The weight of the helmet, the snug embrace of the G-suit around her legs and abdomen, the precise tension of the harness straps across her shoulders, the way her gloved hand had wrapped around the control stick, an extension of her own body, the fierce joy of pushing a $30 million machine to its limits and beyond. And beneath it all always, the knowledge that she had no margin for error, not because the aircraft demanded perfection, but because she was a woman in a man's world, and every mistake would be magnified, every success diminished. The constant, grinding pressure to be twice as good to be considered half as capable. She lowered the binoculars, suddenly weary. Perhaps she should not have come after all. The teenagers had followed her. Peg noticed them out of the corner of her eye, 3 boys and a girl, probably 16 or 17, phones out, poorly concealing their amusement. The tallest boy made a show of taking her photo, then turned to show his friends, triggering another round of laughter. "Grandma thinks she's Maverick," the girl said, not bothering to lower her voice. "More like Methuselah," another boy replied. Peg kept her gaze on the distant flight line. She had faced worse than teenage mockery, far worse. Still, the words stung in a way that surprised her. Age had not thickened her skin as much as she had hoped. The small group drifted closer, emboldened by her lack of reaction. "Excuse me, ma'am," the tallest boy called, his voice carrying a false politeness that set Peg's teeth on edge. "My friend says you told the volunteers you were a fighter pilot. Is that true?" Peg turned slowly, evaluating the group. Their expressions held that particular mix of amusement and cruelty, unique to adolescents who have not yet learned the difference between wit and unkindness. "Yes," she said simply. No elaboration, no defensiveness, just the plain truth. The boy's eyebrows shot up, clearly surprised she had answered at all. "For real? Like actual dogfights and dropping bombs and stuff?" "Yes." Peg turned back to the tarmac, lifting her binoculars again. "But you're," the boy began. "A woman," Peg supplied, not lowering the binoculars. "Correct." The girl in the group stepped closer, curiosity momentarily overriding her desire to fit in with the boys. When was this? I flew my first combat missions during Operation Desert Storm, January 1991. That's like ancient history, one of the other boys said. Thank you for that perspective, Peg replied dryly. The tallest boy snorted. No offense, lady, but I don't think they even let women fly combat missions back then. Peg lowered her binoculars and turned to face them fully. Officially, no, they didn't. Not until 1993, but in war, necessity often overrides policy. So you're saying you flew illegally? The girl asked, her phone now recording video. I'm saying I flew, Peg replied. The paperwork sorted itself out later. The tallest boy nudged his friend. Dude, she's totally making this up. My dad was in the Marines, and he said women weren't in combat roles until way later. Your father was correct about official policy, Peg acknowledged. The combat exclusion laws weren't fully repealed until the 90s, but there were exceptions that didn't make the history books. Right, the boy drawled, rolling his eyes. Secret woman fighter pilots. Next you'll tell us you shot down Saddam Hussein personally. The girl's phone was still recording. If you were really a pilot, where's your proof? Peg looked at them for a long moment. These children, so certain of their worldview, so convinced of their superior knowledge. I don't carry my service record to airshows, she said finally, and I don't need to prove anything to you. She turned away, conversation over, and focused again on the distant flight line. After a few moments of awkward silence, the teenagers drifted away, already losing interest. Peg exhaled slowly. Their disbelief was nothing new. What bothered her more was the realization that her story might eventually disappear entirely, that the contributions of women like her might fade from memory, dismissed as exaggeration or fiction. History had a way of simplifying itself over time, smoothing away the exceptions, the complications, the inconvenient truths. From across the airfield, the distinctive roar of jet engines cut through her thoughts. Two FA-18E Super Hornets taxied into view, preparing for takeoff. VFA-14 Top Hatters. Not her old unit, but a storied squadron nonetheless. As the jets lined up on the runway, Peg felt her body unconsciously mimic the pre-flight check sequence. Trim set, flaps positioned, throttle advanced. Her right hand twitched slightly, muscle memory reaching for a control stick that wasn't there. Her left leg tensed, preparing to counter the torque on takeoff. The jets thundered down the runway and lifted into the clear California sky, afterburners engaged, climbing at a steep angle. Peg's eyes tracked them with the precision that came from thousands of flight hours. Not the wide-eyed gaze of a civilian watching in wonder, but the calculated assessment of a pilot evaluating performance. Beautiful, she murmured to herself. She didn't notice the older man who had stopped several yards behind her, watching not the jets but her reactions to them. Didn't see the way his eyes narrowed in recognition, not of her face but of her bearing. The way she moved, the way she tracked the aircraft. The unconscious tells that separated those who had piloted such machines from those who had merely admired them. Admiral James "Hawk" Morrison, retired rear admiral, leaned against the nearby fence and continued to observe the silver-haired woman with the navy cap and the two knowing eyes. Morrison had not planned to attend the air show. At 70, he had seen enough military displays to last several lifetimes, but his grandson had begged, and Morrison had never been able to deny the boy anything. So here he was, nursing a mediocre coffee while 8-year-old Jacob explored the static displays with his father. Morrison scanned the growing crowds with the habitual alertness of a man who had spent decades in command positions. His attention caught on a silver-haired woman standing alone at the fence line. Something about her posture struck him as familiar. Military bearing, certainly, but something more specific. The way she held her head, the precise angle of her spine despite her obvious use of a cane, the economy of her movements. When the two FA-18s had taken off, Morrison had watched her reaction with growing curiosity. Civilians watched jets with wonder or excitement. This woman watched them with analysis. He recognized the tells because he had seen them countless times in pilots watching other pilots fly. That distinctive mixture of professional assessment and muscle memory, the body remembering what it was like to be in that cockpit. A female pilot of her apparent age would have been active during Desert Storm, perhaps, the early days of women transitioning into combat roles. He rose from his seat, coffee forgotten, and made his way toward the fence line. As he approached, he noticed she was now being hassled by a group of teenagers. Morrison slowed, not wanting to intrude but close enough to overhear the exchange. He caught fragments, the woman's calm responses about flying combat missions during Desert Storm. Morrison's eyebrows rose. If she was telling the truth, she would have been one of the very first. The teenagers finally moved on, and Morrison approached carefully. "Those kids don't know what they're missing," he said conversationally. "It's not every day you get to meet a pioneer." The woman turned, her expression guarded but not unwelcoming. "Excuse me." Morrison gestured toward her Navy cap. "VFA 81, Sunliners, Persian Gulf, I'm guessing." A flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly masked. "Yes." "James Morrison," he said, extending his hand. "Rear Admiral, retired, though most people called me Hawk." Her handshake was firm and brief. "Margaret Calloway, most people call me Peg." Morrison felt a jolt of recognition. Wildcat Calloway, from the Gulf War. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Almost no one calls me that anymore." "But you are that Calloway, the one who flew the night mission over Baghdad, January of '91. Peg studied him for a long moment, as if assessing whether he was sincere. "I flew several night missions over Baghdad in January of '91, she said finally, "though I doubt most of them made it into any official records you would have seen." Morrison's face broke into a broad grin. "I'll be damned, I never thought I'd actually meet you. The stories I heard." He trailed off, suddenly aware that he might be overstepping. "Most of those stories were exaggerated," Peg said, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. "Maybe so, but not all of them, I'd wager." Morrison glanced toward the VIP section. "What are you doing standing out here by the fence? You should be in the veteran seating." Peg's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "Current military ID required, apparently. Mine expired with my service." Morrison frowned. "That's ridiculous, come with me, I'll straighten this out." "That's not necessary, Admiral." "Hawk, please, and yes, it is necessary." He gestured toward the VIP entrance. "Shall we?" Peg hesitated, then nodded once, sharply. They walked together toward the entrance, Morrison deliberately slowing his pace to account for her slight limp. "How much of what I've heard is true?" he asked as they walked. "The night mission over Baghdad, the SAM evasion with a damaged wing, the rescue operation." "Depends on what version you heard," Peg replied. "Stories tend to improve with retelling." "Fair enough, but you were one of the first, before the policy change." "I was one of 7 women selected for the test program in 1983, Peg confirmed. "We weren't supposed to see combat. Then the Gulf War happened, and suddenly the rules became flexible." They reached the VIP entrance. The same 2 volunteers who had turned Peg away earlier looked up with identical expressions of surprise. "Admiral Morrison," the male volunteer said, straightening. "Good morning, sir." "Morning," Morrison replied briskly. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding. This is Captain Margaret Calloway, one of the first female combat pilots in the history of the United States Navy. She flew FA-18s during Desert Storm. She should absolutely be in the veterans section." The volunteers exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Sir, we're required to check current military ID," the female volunteer began. Morrison cut her off. "I understand you have protocols. Consider this a direct override. Captain Calloway is my personal guest." The male volunteer hesitated only briefly before lifting the rope barrier. "Of course, sir. Please go right in." Morrison nodded and gestured for Peg to precede him. As they moved past the volunteers, he caught her slight smile. "Still pulling rank, Admiral," she murmured. "Only when necessary, Captain," he replied. "And it's Hawk, remember." "Then I suppose you should call me Peg," she said. "Almost no one does anymore, but it seems fitting for the occasion." As they entered the VIP section, Morrison noticed a man standing near the refreshment table, watching them with unusual intensity. Something about his focus on Peg seemed off. The man quickly looked away when Morrison made eye contact. Morrison filed the observation away for later consideration. The VIP section offered padded seats, shade, and a prime viewing position for the aerial demonstrations. Morrison guided Peg to two empty seats at the end of a row. "Better than the fence line?" he asked as they settled in. "Marginally," Peg replied, but there was a hint of amusement in her voice, "though the company has improved considerably." From across the airfield, the distinctive sound of jet engines warming up signaled the approaching start of the demonstration. Peg's gaze shifted immediately to the flight line, her body subtly tensing in anticipation. Morrison studied her profile. "You miss it," he said, not a question. "Every day," she answered without looking away from the distant aircraft. "You." "Not the paperwork, not the politics, but the rest of it," Morrison nodded slowly. "Yes, every damn day." Baghdad, January 17, 1991, 200 hours local time. The night was alive with fire. From her position at 30,000 feet, Lieutenant Margaret Calloway could see the Iraqi capital burning. Anti-aircraft artillery traced glowing paths through the darkness below, searching blindly for coalition aircraft. The city's electrical grid had been among the first targets. Now only emergency generators and fires provided illumination. Inside her cockpit, Peg focused on her instruments, forcing herself to breathe evenly despite the adrenaline surging through her system. The FA-18C Hornet responded to her slightest touch, an extension of her body and will. She had trained for this moment for years, though officially, women weren't supposed to fly combat missions. But war had a way of rewriting rules on the fly, and the Navy suddenly found itself with a shortage of qualified pilots and a surplus of targets. "Sunliner 27, this is AWACS," the radio crackled. "New tasking. We have a SAM site that's gone hot south of your position. Sending coordinates now." Peg acknowledged and banked her aircraft toward the new target, her wingman following her lead. "Copy AWACS," she replied, keeping her voice level and professional. "Sunliner 27 proceeding to target." She didn't mention that this would be her third sortie in 18 hours, or that fatigue was beginning to dull her edges, or that the persistent rumors about women not having the physical stamina for sustained combat operations made every mission a referendum on her gender as well as her skills. None of that mattered now, only the mission. The target coordinates appeared on her display. Peg would come in low and fast, deploy her AGM-88 HARM anti-radiation missiles to take out the radar systems, then follow with conventional bombs on the missile launchers themselves. "Sunliner 28, I'll take the lead on this one," she said to her wingman. "You follow and hit anything I miss." "Copy that 2-7, came the reply. Lieutenant Commander David Fletcher, callsign Eagle, was one of the few male pilots who had never questioned her abilities. "I've got your 6. Peg began her descent, throttling back to reduce her heat signature. 10,000 feet, 8,000, 6,000. She tightened her grip on the control stick, feeling the familiar pressure of G-forces as she maneuvered. The specialized G-suit around her legs and abdomen compressed automatically, forcing blood back toward her heart and brain. Peg had developed her own techniques for managing high G maneuvers, focusing on specific muscle groups and breathing patterns that seemed to work better for her female physiology. 2-7, AWACS here. Be advised we're seeing additional radar signatures in your target area. Looks like they've brought in reinforcements. Copy that, AWACS, proceeding as planned. 3,000 feet now. The dark terrain below resolved into more detailed features: roads, buildings, the silhouettes of missile launchers and radar arrays. Peg armed her weapons systems and acquired the primary target's radar emissions. 2-7 radar lock Fox 3. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the HARM missile dropped from its hardpoint and ignited, streaking toward the enemy radar installation. Peg was already adjusting her aim for a second launch when warning indicators flashed across her display. Missile launch, SAM 4 o'clock. The surface-to-air missile had appeared seemingly from nowhere, from a site not indicated in their intelligence briefing. Peg reacted instinctively, rolling the aircraft and deploying countermeasures. Chaff dispersed behind her, creating a cloud of radar-reflective material to confuse the incoming missile. The SAM detonated prematurely, fooled by the countermeasures, but the explosion was close enough to buffet the Hornet with its shock wave. Peg fought to maintain control as her aircraft bucked and shuddered. 2-7, you're trailing smoke, Fletcher called over the radio. Port engine. Peg scanned her instruments. The port engine was showing elevated temperatures but was still functioning. Not critical yet, but a concern. She made an instant decision. "Continuing mission," she responded, already lining up her second missile launch. The remaining SAM site was still operational, its radar pinging her aircraft. Peg released her second HARM missile. The explosion bloomed in the darkness below, followed by secondary detonations as ammunition cooked off. "Good hit, 2-7, Fletcher confirmed. "Radar site is down." Peg began to bank away from the target area when a new alarm sounded. The damaged engine was now showing critical readings. 2-7, you're on fire, Fletcher reported, his voice tense. "Port engine is definitely burning." Peg ran through her emergency procedures, shutting down the affected engine and activating the fire suppression system. The Hornet could fly on a single engine, but its performance would be severely compromised, and they were still over hostile territory. AWACS Sunliner 2-7. I've got an engine fire contained for now. Request vector to nearest friendly airspace. Copy 2-7. Turn to heading 270. Nearest friendly territory is Kuwait border, 120 miles. Peg calculated fuel consumption against distance. With one engine, the math was tight but doable, if nothing else went wrong. 2-8, return to base, she instructed Fletcher. No sense in both of us running on fumes. Negative 2-7, he replied immediately. I'm staying on your wing until you're over friendly territory. That's non-negotiable. Despite the circumstances, Peg felt a flicker of gratitude. Fletcher had never treated her differently because of her gender. In the air, they were just pilots watching each other's backs. The return flight was tense. Peg nursed the damaged aircraft along, constantly adjusting for the asymmetrical thrust of the single working engine. The fire warning light had gone out, but other system warnings continued to illuminate her cockpit. Hydraulic pressure dropping, fuel level critical, multiple circuit failures in the port wing. "How's it looking, Wildcat?" Fletcher asked, using her callsign for the first time in the mission. "I've had better days," she replied, "but I've had worse." "That's the spirit, 20 miles to friendly territory." Peg's arms were beginning to tremble with the effort of controlling the damaged aircraft. The Hornet wanted to roll to port, the dead engine creating constant drag that she had to compensate for manually. 15 miles, 10-5. AWACS, Sunliner 27 crossing into friendly airspace now, Fletcher reported. "Copy that 28, 27, what's your fuel state?" Peg glanced at the gauge, hovering just above empty, minimal. "Understood. We're vectoring a tanker to your position. Can you climb to 15,000 feet?" Peg experimentally eased back on the stick, feeling the aircraft's sluggish response. "Negative, AWACS. Best I can give you is 10,000. "Copy. Tanker will descend to your altitude. ETA 4 minutes. 4 minutes? With her current fuel state, it would be close. 27, your right wing is dipping, Fletcher warned. Watch your bank angle. Peg realized she had momentarily lost focus, allowing the aircraft to roll slightly to starboard. She corrected, ignoring the burning in her shoulders and arms. Just a few more minutes. The tanker appeared ahead of them, a KC-135 Stratotanker descending to their altitude. Peg had performed aerial refueling numerous times in training, but never with a damaged aircraft running on a single engine. "You can do this, Wildcat," Fletcher encouraged. "Just like training, nice and easy." Peg maneuvered her Hornet into position behind the tanker, focusing on the refueling boom. Her vision had begun to narrow, a sign of extreme fatigue and stress. She forced herself to breathe deeply, fighting against the tunnel vision. The refueling probe connected with the boom, and precious fuel began flowing into her nearly empty tanks. After what seemed like an eternity but was actually less than 2 minutes, Peg had enough fuel to reach the nearest emergency landing field. She disconnected from the tanker and turned toward the coordinates provided by AWACS. "Sunliner 27, this is Talil Air Base. We've got emergency crews standing by. You're cleared for immediate landing on runway 27. The landing was one of the most challenging of her career. With compromised hydraulics and asymmetrical thrust, the Hornet fought her all the way down. Peg's arms felt like lead, but her touch on the controls remained precise. The aircraft touched down harder than she would have liked, but the wheels held. As the Hornet rolled to a stop, emergency vehicles raced toward her from both sides of the runway. Peg began the shutdown procedures for the remaining engine, her movements automatic despite her exhaustion. Only when the cockpit was completely silent did she allow herself a moment of pure relief. She had made it back. The mission was completed successfully. And she had proven once again that women could not only fly combat missions, but could handle the worst that war could throw at them. Peg removed her helmet, her silver blonde hair darkened with sweat, and took a deep breath of the cool cockpit air. Another mission, another day, in a war that history would remember but would likely forget her role in it. That erasure would begin sooner than she knew. In the official after-action report filed 48 hours later, her callsign would be replaced with the anonymous designation, support aircraft. Her actions would be attributed to unnamed elements of the strike package. The woman who had kept her aircraft flying through burning skies would become, on paper, nobody at all. The next morning at Talil Air Base, Peg stood in the debriefing room as Lieutenant Colonel Robert Stafford, the Air Group commander, a precise man with a precise manner, read her after-action report without expression. Your actions were unorthodox and violated standard engagement protocols, he said finally. Yes, sir. They were also remarkably effective. Preliminary reports indicate you neutralized 4 SAM sites with minimal ordnance expenditure, potentially saving 2 aircraft and their pilots. Peg hadn't expected this assessment. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Lieutenant, Stafford cautioned. Your after-action report will require significant adjustment before submission to higher command. Peg understood immediately what he meant. Her role would be downplayed, possibly eliminated entirely from the official record. Women weren't supposed to be flying combat missions, certainly not leading them. I understand, sir. I'm not sure you do, Stafford replied. Your actions today were exceptional, Lieutenant Calloway. In another time, they would merit consideration for distinguished service recognition. But today, they present a political complication that goes beyond this air group's authority to address. Peg absorbed this in silence. She had known the reality of her position from the beginning. Return to your quarters, Lieutenant. We'll discuss this further during debriefing. Yes, sir. The channel went silent, leaving Peg alone with her thoughts. The horizon was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. She felt the familiar ache of recognition denied, of achievement rendered invisible. But stronger than that was the satisfaction of knowing that Fletcher would survive, that her skills and courage had made a difference. She had not become a fighter pilot for recognition. She had become a fighter pilot to fly, to test her limits, to serve. And measured against those standards, today's mission had been an unqualified success. Pensacola Naval Air Station, Florida, summer 1983. The human body was not designed to withstand the forces you will experience in high-performance aircraft, Commander William Stevens lectured the small group of flight candidates seated before him. At 9 GS, blood weighing normally 12 pounds per gallon now weighs 108 pounds. Your heart struggles to pump this weight. Blood drains from your brain to pool in your lower extremities. Margaret Calloway sat ramrod straight in the third row, her attention fixed on the commander. At 25, she was one of 7 women selected for the Navy's experimental program to train female pilots for possible combat roles. An amendment to the Women's Armed Services Integration Act had recently opened new aviation positions to women, though the combat exclusion laws still prohibited them from direct combat assignments. For now, they were being trained alongside their male counterparts, with the understanding that their eventual assignments would be limited to non-combat roles, transport, reconnaissance, training. But Peg had not joined the Navy to fly cargo planes. She had come to fly fighters, and she intended to be so good that the rules would eventually bend for her. Many of you will experience GLOC, gravity-induced loss of consciousness, during your training, Stevens continued. This is not a sign of weakness, but a natural limitation of human physiology. Your task is to learn to manage these forces effectively. Peg made careful notes, her handwriting precise and orderly. Next to her, Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Barker leaned over and whispered, "Wasting your time, Calloway. Women black out at lower G-forces than men. Basic biology." Peg didn't look up from her notebook. "Is that a fact, Barker? I must have missed that research paper." "It's common knowledge," Barker persisted. "Smaller hearts, less muscle mass. You'll wash out in the centrifuge, guaranteed." "Mr. Barker," Commander Stevens called from the front of the room, "perhaps you'd like to share your insights with the entire class." Barker straightened. "No, sir." "Then I suggest you focus on your own training, rather than predicting the failure of your classmates." Peg kept her expression neutral, though she appreciated the commander's intervention. Stevens was one of the few instructors who seemed to genuinely believe in the experimental program. Others made their skepticism clear through small comments, excessive scrutiny of female candidates' performance, or the occasional accidental use of male pronouns when describing fighter pilots. The lecture continued, detailing the physiological effects of sustained G-forces and the anti-G straining maneuver, the AGSM, that pilots used to counter them. Peg listened intently, mentally rehearsing the techniques described. After the lecture, the candidates moved to the centrifuge facility. Peg watched as the first candidates took their turns. Barker went early, emerging from his session pale and shaky but technically successful. He avoided eye contact with Peg as he passed her. "Calloway, you're up," the technician called. Peg rose and walked to the centrifuge capsule with deliberate calm. Inside, she strapped herself into the seat and adjusted the helmet and oxygen mask. The capsule door closed with a hydraulic hiss. "Centrifuge, run beginning in 30 seconds. We'll start at 3 GS and increase gradually. Standard protocol is to hold for 30 seconds at each level. If you experience tunnel vision or nausea, report immediately." "Copy that," Peg replied, settling deeper into the seat. She ran through a mental checklist, adjusting her posture and positioning her arms and legs for optimal blood flow. The centrifuge began to move, building speed gradually. At 3 GS, Peg felt the familiar heaviness, as if her flight suit had suddenly been filled with sand. She began the AGSM, tensing her legs, abdomen, and chest while executing the specialized breathing pattern. "3 GS stable. How are you feeling, Calloway?" "Fine, no issues." Increasing to 4 GS. The pressure intensified. Peg continued the AGSM, focusing on maintaining consistent muscle tension without exhausting herself too quickly. 4 GS stable, moving to 5 GS. At 5 GS, her vision began to narrow slightly. She adjusted her breathing pattern, making each breath more forceful, and increased the tension in her legs and core muscles. 5 GS stable. How are you doing, Calloway? Still good, proceeding. Roger that, increasing to 6 GS. 6 GS hit her like a weight dropped onto her chest. Peg's peripheral vision darkened further, creating a tunneling effect. She could feel her heart pounding, struggling against the increased blood weight. The AGSM became more difficult to maintain as her muscles began to fatigue, but she pushed through, refusing to give in. Outside the centrifuge, a small group had gathered to observe. Peg couldn't see them, but she knew they were there, watching, waiting for her to fail. 6 GS stable, 30 seconds complete, increasing to 7 GS. 7 GS was the threshold where many candidates began to struggle seriously. Peg felt as if an elephant were sitting on her chest. Her vision narrowed to a small circle directly ahead. 7 GS stable, 25 seconds. Peg's right hand had begun to tremble with the effort of maintaining the AGSM. She clenched it into a fist, refusing to give in. 30 seconds at 7 GS complete, preparing for 8 GS. 8 GS was where many experienced male pilots reached their limit. As the pressure increased, Peg felt as if she were being crushed from all directions simultaneously. The tunnel vision constricted further until she could see only a small point of light directly ahead. But she held on, drawing on reserves of determination she hadn't known she possessed. 30 seconds at 8 GS complete. Outstanding, Calloway. We're proceeding to 9 GS. 9 GS was the maximum that the FA-18 could pull in combat maneuvers. At this level, Peg's body weighed 9 times its normal amount. The pressure was almost unbearable. Her vision reduced to a pinpoint, then began to gray out entirely. 9GS stable, 10 seconds. Peg fought against the encroaching darkness with everything she had. This was the moment. Pass or fail. Prove them right or prove them wrong. 15 seconds. The world began to disappear. With her last coherent thought, Peg adjusted her technique, changing the rhythm of her breathing and shifting the focus of muscle tension from her legs to her core. A modification of the standard AGSM that felt intuitively right for her body's responses. 25 seconds. The darkness receded slightly. Peg held on. 30 seconds at 9GS complete, decreasing to 4GS for recovery. As the pressure eased, Peg's vision gradually returned. She gulped air into her oxygen-starved lungs, feeling the sweet relief of normal gravity returning. Centrifuge run complete. Callaway, you just completed a full profile run to 9GS. That's exceptional performance. When the centrifuge capsule opened, Peg stepped out steadily, though her legs felt like rubber and her flight suit was soaked with sweat. Commander Stevens approached her, clipboard in hand. Impressive performance, Callaway. You modified the standard AGSM during the 9G segment. Care to explain? The standard technique wasn't working optimally for me at that level, sir. I shifted focus to core compression rather than leg tension. It seemed to improve blood return to the brain. Stevens made a note. Interesting. We may want to study that further. In any case, you've just set a new record for female candidates in the centrifuge. From the back of the group, Barker called out, "Beginner's luck. Let's see how she handles it in an actual aircraft." Stevens turned sharply. "Mr. Barker, 5 extra miles on your morning run tomorrow might help you focus on your own performance rather than Lieutenant Callaway's." Peg walked past the group toward the changing rooms. As she reached the door, she heard a voice behind her. "Hey, Callaway." She turned to see Lieutenant Commander Richard Hale, one of the most experienced flight instructors and a known skeptic of the women's training program. "Sir," she responded neutrally. Hale studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "They've started a pool on how long you'll last." Peg met his gaze steadily. "And what did you put down, Commander?" A ghost of a smile flickered across Hale's face. "I haven't decided yet." Peg nodded once and continued through the door. She had expected the betting pool, but she had just proved something important, not only to them but to herself. The question wasn't how long she would last. The question was how far she would go. And the answer to that, if Peg had anything to say about it, was all the way. Peg's early training flights with Richard "Iron Man" Hale established a dynamic she would come to understand well. He pushed her not because he wanted her to fail, but because he didn't yet know what she was capable of. Neither did she. 2 days after the centrifuge test, Peg reported for her first one-on-one training flight with Hale. The pre-dawn air was heavy with humidity as she arrived at the flight line. The T-45 Goshawk trainer sat on the tarmac, its sleek form barely visible in the dim light. Hale was already there, reviewing the flight plan. He acknowledged Peg's arrival with a curt nod. "Callaway, pre-flight checklist is on the clipboard. I'll observe." Peg took the clipboard and began the methodical inspection of the aircraft, moving with practiced efficiency. Hale followed silently, watching her work without comment. The silence was a test in itself. "Pre-flight complete, sir," Peg reported. "Aircraft is ready." Hale reviewed her checklist, then nodded once. "Mount up." They climbed into the tandem seat trainer, Peg in the front, Hale in the instructor's position behind her. "Today's flight will evaluate your basic handling skills and G-tolerance in an actual aircraft," Hale said. "The centrifuge is one thing. Real flight dynamics are another." Understood, sir. And Calloway, if you need to abort any maneuver, there's no shame in it. Better to recognize your limitations than to push beyond them and endanger the aircraft. Peg understood the subtext. Hale was giving her permission to fail, expecting her to fail. Noted, sir. They taxied to the runway and received clearance for takeoff. Peg advanced the throttle smoothly, feeling the trainer accelerate down the runway. The aircraft lifted off cleanly, and she established a climbing turn to their designated practice area over the Gulf of Mexico. Once they reached altitude, Hale wasted no time. Barrel roll left to right. Peg executed the maneuver with precision. Acceptable, Hale commented. Now a loop, tighter this time. Peg complied, pulling the aircraft into a tighter loop that generated nearly 6 gs at the bottom. Her muscles protested, but she maintained precise control. They continued for nearly an hour, Hale pushing Peg through increasingly demanding maneuvers. He never praised, merely acknowledging successful execution with acceptable or adequate. But he never criticized either, which from Hale was tantamount to approval. Finally, as their fuel state approached the return threshold, Hale took control. My aircraft. Your aircraft, Peg confirmed. Without warning, Hale executed a sequence of violent maneuvers, a snap roll that transitioned immediately into a splittess, followed by a hard pull into a climbing spiral. The G-forces hit Peg like a physical blow. Her vision tunneled instantly, darkness creeping in from the edges. She fought to maintain consciousness, employing every technique she had developed. When he finally leveled the aircraft, Peg was breathing hard, her flight suit soaked with sweat. She had maintained consciousness, but just barely. Your aircraft, Hale said. Peg took the controls with hands that trembled slightly. Return to base, Hale instructed. Peg executed a textbook landing. Only when they had dismounted and removed their helmets did Hale finally speak. You modified the standard AGSM again, during the high G sequence. Peg nodded. Yes, sir. The standard technique is designed primarily for male physiology. I've found that adjusting the muscle tension patterns and breathing rhythm works better for me. Hale considered this. The standard technique has been developed over decades of research. With primarily male test subjects, Peg pointed out, then added, sir. Something flickered in Hale's eyes, curiosity. You're suggesting women need different G-tolerance techniques. I'm suggesting I needed a different technique. I can only speak for myself. Hale studied her for a long moment. You didn't black out during that last sequence. Most candidates would have. I came close, Peg admitted. But you didn't, and you maintained aircraft awareness throughout. That's noteworthy. Coming from Hale, this was high praise. Hale's next words, however, caught her off guard. It won't be enough, you know. Sorry. Being as good as the men, even being better than most of them, the system isn't designed for exceptions. Hale's tone wasn't unkind, merely matter of fact. Combat exclusion laws aren't going to change just because Lieutenant Margaret Calloway can pull 7 GS without blacking out. Peg met his gaze. With respect, sir, systems can change. They have before. Not without significant pressure, Hale countered, and considerable time. Then I'll apply pressure, Peg said simply, and I have time. The ghost of a smile appeared on Hale's face. Stubborn. Determined, Peg corrected. As Hale walked away, Peg allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She hadn't won him over, far from it, but she had earned something more valuable than approval, respect. And respect, however reluctantly given, was a foundation she could build on. One flight at a time, one test at a time, one skeptic at a time. Miramar Naval Air Station, present day, 2025. The distinctive roar of FA-18 engines drew every eye skyward as the Blue Angels demonstration team began their approach to the airfield. 6 Super Hornets in tight formation, their blue and gold paintwork gleaming in the California sun. In the VIP section, Peg watched with a professional's eye, noting subtle details in the aircraft handling and formation positioning that would be invisible to most observers. Beside her, Admiral Morrison did the same. "They're good," Peg commented, "better than in my day." "The aircraft have improved," Morrison replied, "more responsive, better thrust-to-weight ratio." "It's not just the aircraft. Their formation discipline is exceptional." The MC's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, providing commentary on the aerial demonstration. He spoke about the legacy of naval aviation, the traditions of excellence and courage. But something in his words caught Peg's attention, a glaring omission in the historical narrative. In 1993, the combat exclusion laws were finally lifted, allowing women to fly combat missions in the United States Navy, the MC announced proudly. Peg's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. Morrison noticed. "What is it?" he asked. 1991, Peg said quietly. "We flew combat missions in 1991, 2 years before the official policy change. Desert Storm. The history books always get it wrong." Morrison nodded in understanding. The inconvenient exceptions, easier to present a clean narrative of progress. "Easier," Peg agreed, "but not accurate." She didn't elaborate, but Morrison understood. The women who had flown combat missions during Desert Storm, their contributions had been deliberately obscured, their roles minimized in official records, their achievements attributed to others or left unacknowledged entirely. "For what it's worth," Morrison said, "those of us who were there knew the truth, still do." Peg nodded but didn't respond. The truth known to a few insiders was cold comfort compared to the systematic erasure from official history. Across the VIP section, Peg noticed a man watching her with unusual intensity. Older, with the bearing of a career military officer. There was something vaguely familiar about him, but she couldn't place him. As if sensing her attention, the man rose from his seat and made his way toward them. He moved with the slightly stiff gait of someone who had spent too many hours in cockpits. A fellow pilot, Peg realized. Morrison tensed slightly as the man approached, but Peg placed a gentle hand on his arm, signaling that she wasn't concerned. The man stopped before them, standing at an almost formal distance. His eyes, lined with age but still sharp, fixed on Peg with an expression that mixed disbelief, recognition, and guilt. "Captain Calloway?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Peg studied him more carefully. There was definitely something familiar in his features, but the years had changed him significantly. "Yes," she confirmed. "I'm sorry, have we met?" The man swallowed hard. "David Fletcher, ma'am, though you probably knew me as Eagle." Peg's breath caught. Lieutenant Commander David Fletcher, her wingman during Desert Storm. The pilot whose life she had saved during that desperate mission over Baghdad. The man for whom she had risked her own life and aircraft, only to have her actions officially attributed to an unnamed support aircraft. "Fletcher," she said quietly, "it's been a long time." 34 years, he confirmed. "I never thought I'd see you again." Morrison looked between them, sensing the weight of history. "I'll give you two a moment," he said, standing. "I should check on my grandson anyway." As Morrison moved away, Fletcher took his vacant seat, his movements betraying a nervousness at odds with his otherwise commanding presence. Peg noted the 3 stars on his collar. He had done well for himself. It's Vice Admiral Fletcher now, I see, she observed. Retired last year, he confirmed. Naval aviation all the way. He paused, struggling for words. Captain, I don't know where to begin. How about the truth? Peg suggested, her tone neutral but firm. That seems like a good starting point. Fletcher nodded, accepting the challenge. He took a deep breath. I never thanked you, not properly, for what you did that night over Baghdad. You were unconscious when they pulled you from your aircraft, Peg reminded him. And afterward, there wasn't exactly an opportunity. There were opportunities, Fletcher corrected himself. I just didn't take them, and for that I have no excuse. Peg said nothing, waiting for him to continue. The roar of the Blue Angels performing overhead filled the silence between them. They told me to keep quiet about what happened, Fletcher finally said. Said it would complicate things politically if it got out that a female pilot had been involved in direct combat operations. And you agreed, Peg stated, not a question. Fletcher looked down at his hands. I did. I was young, ambitious. I didn't want to rock the boat. He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. I told myself it didn't matter, that the official record would eventually catch up with reality once the policies changed. But they weren't, Peg said simply. No, Fletcher admitted, and by the time I was in a position to correct the record, too much time had passed. He met her gaze again. I'm sorry, Captain, more sorry than I can express. What would you have me say, Admiral? Peg asked finally. That I forgive you, that it doesn't matter. I wouldn't presume to ask for forgiveness, Fletcher replied. And we both know it did matter, still does. He paused. I'm not here to ease my conscience, Captain. I'm here because I saw you across the room and realized I had a chance finally to acknowledge the truth. Peg's expression softened slightly. I appreciate that. Better late than never, I suppose. Fletcher nodded. There's something else. Those techniques you developed for handling G-forces, the modified AGSM. What about them? They've been incorporated into standard training for all naval aviators. Not officially attributed to you, of course, but they've reduced GLOC incidents significantly. Saved lives. But no one knows where they came from, Peg observed. Not officially, Fletcher admitted. For what it's worth, those of us who were there, we passed it along, pilot to pilot. The Wildcat method, some called it. Others just knew them as the Callaway techniques. Peg hadn't heard this before. Really? Fletcher nodded. Really? Among veteran pilots, especially those of us from the Gulf War era, your name still means something. Thank you for telling me, she said. Fletcher looked as if he wanted to say more, but at that moment, Morrison returned, accompanied by a young woman in a flight suit, the distinctive uniform of the Blue Angels demonstration team. Captain Callaway, Morrison said, I'd like you to meet Lieutenant Commander Sarah Reyes, one of the Blue Angels pilots. The young woman extended her hand. Captain Callaway, it's an honor. Admiral Morrison tells me you were one of the first female combat pilots in the Navy. Peg shook her hand. One of them, yes. The Admiral said you flew FA-18s during Desert Storm, before the combat restrictions were officially lifted. Peg glanced at Fletcher, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. Yes, though you won't find that in many history books. Actually, Reyes said, her expression brightening, you're in the unofficial curriculum at Top Gun, not the public materials but in the pilot-to-pilot lore. The Callaway techniques for G-tolerance, they're still taught, especially to female candidates. Peg couldn't hide her surprise. They are. Reyes nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely. They saved my career during advanced training. I was struggling with GLOC until my instructor, an old Gulf War veteran, pulled me aside and taught me your modified AGSM approach. Changed everything for me." Morrison smiled. "I thought you two should meet. Commander Reyes has been researching the early female combat pilots for a project she's working on." "Not just researching," Reyes clarified. "I'm part of an initiative to correct the historical record, to document the contributions of women who flew combat missions before the official policy changes, to make sure those stories aren't lost." Peg felt something shift inside her, a small knot of resignation loosening after decades. "I'd like to hear more about this project," she said, her voice slightly rougher than before. "I was hoping you'd say that," Reyes replied with a grin, "because there's something I'd like to ask you." Before she could continue, an airshow official approached. "Commander Reyes, you're needed for the pre-flight briefing. The second demonstration begins in 30 minutes. Reyes looked disappointed. "I have to go, but—" She turned to Peg. "Would you be willing to stay after the show? There's something I'd like to show you." "Of course," Peg agreed, intrigued. As Reyes hurried away, Peg became aware of another presence nearby. The man Morrison had noticed earlier, Tommy Lawton, was now standing just at the edge of the VIP section, openly staring at their group. There was something unsettling in his gaze, a hostility that seemed directed specifically at Peg. Morrison followed her gaze and frowned. "That's the second time I've seen him watching you. Do you know him?" "I don't think so," Peg said. Fletcher had noticed as well. "That's Tommy Lawton, former naval officer, washed out of flight school in the 90s. He's been vocal about women in combat roles, runs a blog dedicated to preserving traditional military values." Peg had encountered many such men throughout her career. "I see." "He might have just recognized you," Fletcher suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe," Morrison agreed, "but I don't like how focused he is. I'm going to have security keep an eye on him." As Morrison moved away to speak with security personnel, Peg found herself studying Lawton more carefully. There was something in his expression that went beyond the usual disdain she had encountered from men opposed to women in combat roles. Something more personal. She turned her attention back to the airfield. Peg couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, a convergence of past and present, of hidden history and potential revelation. Fletcher's unexpected appearance, Reyes' project to document the forgotten pioneers, the strange intensity of Lawton's scrutiny. After decades of quiet resignation, of accepting that her contributions would remain largely unacknowledged, Peg found herself facing the possibility that the truth might finally emerge. It was both unsettling and exhilarating, like preparing for takeoff into unknown skies. Whatever happened next, Margaret Peg Calloway was ready to face it, just as she always had been, head-on, no evasive maneuvers. The man Morrison had identified as Tommy Lawton continued to observe Peg from a distance, his gaze calculating. Though security personnel had positioned themselves strategically nearby, they couldn't prevent Lawton from simply watching, from making his presence felt. "He's persistent," Fletcher noted, keeping his voice low. Peg maintained her outward calm. "Neither do I, but there's nothing to be done about it at the moment." Morrison returned, his expression grim. "Security knows who he is. Apparently, he's been vocal on social media about the airshow featuring politically correct displays that showcase female pilots." "Charming," Peg remarked dryly. "They're keeping an eye on him, but he hasn't done anything to warrant removal." Morrison settled back into his seat. "If he approaches, though, they'll intervene." Peg nodded, then deliberately turned her attention back to the airfield. She refused to give Lawton the satisfaction of appearing concerned. The MC's voice boomed across the field. announcing the upcoming solo demonstration by Commander Reyes. A single blue and gold Super Hornet appeared on the horizon, approaching at high speed. As it reached the display area, the aircraft pulled up sharply into a climb that seemed to defy physics, transitioning seamlessly into a tight loop that brought it inverted directly over the crowd. Commander Reyes is demonstrating the Super Hornet's high alpha capabilities, the MC explained. Peg watched with professional appreciation as Reyes put the aircraft through a series of maneuvers that generated extreme G-forces. The young pilot's control was impeccable. "She's good," Peg commented. "Really good." Fletcher nodded in agreement. "Top of her class at Top Gun, one of the best I've seen in years." As the demonstration continued, Peg noticed something in Reyes's flying style that sparked a flicker of recognition. The young pilot was executing high G turns with a technique that seemed oddly familiar, a specific approach to energy management and G-loading that Peg herself had developed decades ago. "She's using my techniques," Peg realized aloud. "Not just the modified AGSM, but the whole approach to energy conservation through high G maneuvers." Fletcher smiled slightly. "I told you your methods lived on, passed from instructor to student, pilot to pilot." As Reyes completed her demonstration with a high-speed pass followed by a victory roll, the crowd erupted in applause. Peg joined in, feeling a complex mixture of pride, nostalgia, and a bittersweet sense of connection across the generations. When the aircraft had taxied to its position and the engines spooled down, the MC announced a short intermission. Morrison excused himself to check on his grandson again, leaving Peg and Fletcher seated together in a moment of awkward silence. "So," Fletcher said finally, "after you left the Navy, what then?" "Consulting work mostly," Peg replied. "Aviation safety, pilot training, curriculum development, some civilian flight instruction." "You never married?" Fletcher asked, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." Peg shook her head. "It's fine. No, I never married. Came close once in the late 90s, a fellow pilot, but our careers took us in different directions." "Children?" "No," Peg said simply. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added, "The Navy was my family. Flying was my child." Fletcher nodded in understanding. "I get that." He changed the subject. "You know, there are people who remember, who know what really happened during Desert Storm. Not many of us left now, but we're still around." "And yet the official history remains unchanged," Peg observed. "Yes," Fletcher acknowledged. "That's why Commander Reyes's project is so important. It might be the last chance to correct the record while first-hand witnesses are still alive to confirm it." Before Peg could respond, a commotion near the edge of the VIP section caught their attention. Tommy Lawton was arguing with security personnel, his voice rising in indignation. "This is a public event. I have every right to be here," Lawton was saying. "Ask Margaret Calloway about Baghdad. Ask her about the real record. She knows the truth." Fletcher tensed beside Peg. "What the hell is he talking about?" "I don't know," Peg replied, though a cold suspicion was forming in her mind. Security reached Lawton, firmly escorting him away from the viewing area. As they led him past the VIP section, his eyes locked with Peg's for a brief moment, filled with a hatred so personal it took her aback. "He knows something," she murmured, "something specific." Morrison had joined them. "Do you recognize him now?" Peg shook her head slowly. "No, but he seems to know me, or think he does." Fletcher spoke slowly. "I may be able to help with that. I have contacts in naval intelligence who could run a discreet background check." Peg studied him curiously. Why are you suddenly so interested in clearing up the historical record, David? You were content to let it lie for over 30 years. Fletcher had the grace to look uncomfortable. Perhaps I'm trying to make amends, however belatedly. For what specifically? Peg pressed. For not correcting the record about the Baghdad mission, or is there something more? Fletcher's expression closed, confirming Peg's suspicion that there was indeed something he wasn't telling her. Let's focus on identifying Lawton first. Then we can address any historical clarifications that might be needed. All right, she agreed. But I expect full transparency moving forward, Admiral. No more convenient omissions. Fletcher nodded, accepting her terms. You have my word. A uniformed officer approached their group, greeting Morrison with a salute. Admiral, Commander Reyes asked me to invite Captain Calloway to the flight line for the final demonstration preparations, if she's willing. Peg looked surprised. The flight line. Yes, ma'am. She said she has something to show you that couldn't wait until after the show. Morrison nodded encouragingly. Go ahead, I'll join you shortly. As Peg rose to follow the officer, Fletcher stood as well. I'll come too if that's all right, for old time's sake. The flight line was a hive of controlled activity, ground crews moving with practiced precision around the gleaming blue and gold Super Hornets. The smell of jet fuel and hot metal brought a rush of memories for Peg, transporting her back to her active duty days. Commander Reyes spotted them approaching and hurried over. Captain Calloway, thank you for coming. Admiral Fletcher, good to see you as well. Impressive flying, Commander, Peg said. You handle the aircraft beautifully. Reyes beamed at the compliment. Coming from you, that means everything, especially since I was using your techniques. She gestured for them to follow her toward one of the aircraft. That's actually what I wanted to show you. As they approached the Super Hornet, Peg noticed something unusual on the aircraft's fuselage, just below the canopy. A small decal, a stylized cat silhouette with the call sign Wildcat beneath it in small, precise lettering. We had it approved as a special edition for today's show, Reyes explained. It's subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice or understand the significance, but it's there. Peg stared at the marking, momentarily speechless. After decades of having her contributions minimized, erased, or attributed to others, this small acknowledgement, a secret recognition visible in plain sight, was unexpectedly powerful. How did you manage this? She asked finally, her voice not quite steady. Reyes smiled. Let's just say there are more people in the current command structure who know the real history than you might think. People who believe it's time to acknowledge the pioneers who paved the way, even if we can't rewrite the official records overnight. Fletcher stepped forward, examining the marking. Wildcat, your old call sign. I remember the first time I heard it used not just as an identifier but as a recognition. After that Baghdad mission, the squadron started using it differently, with respect. Peg nodded, still processing the emotion of the moment. I never knew that. There's more, Reyes said. For the final demonstration today, we've incorporated a special maneuver sequence. One that showcases the techniques you developed, techniques that have saved countless pilots from GLOC over the years. The Calloway sequence, Fletcher asked. Reyes nodded. Exactly. It's listed as the legacy maneuver set in the official program, but every pilot in the squadron knows exactly whose legacy we're honoring. Peg felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with G-forces. After so many years of quiet acceptance, of watching her innovations be adapted and adopted without credit, this acknowledgement, however unofficial, however limited, was profoundly moving. I don't know what to say, she admitted. You don't need to say anything, Reyes replied. Your work speaks for itself, has for decades. She checked her watch. I need to get to the pre-flight briefing, but I wanted you to know before the demonstration, to understand what you're seeing when we fly the sequence. As Reyes hurried off to join her fellow pilots, Peg remained beside the aircraft, her hand resting lightly on the fuselage near the Wildcat marking. Fletcher stood quietly nearby. "It's not the official recognition you deserved," he said finally, "but it's something." "Yes," Peg agreed, "it's something." And in that moment, something felt like enough. Not complete justice, not full acknowledgement, but a meaningful step. A visible, tangible connection between her past innovations and their continuing impact on the present and future of naval aviation. Morrison joined them a few minutes later. "Well, I'll be damned. Wildcat rides again." As they made their way back toward the viewing area for the final demonstration, Peg felt lighter than she had in years. What she didn't notice, as they walked away from the flight line, was Tommy Lawton watching from the shadows of a maintenance hangar, his expression dark with an anger that went beyond mere ideological opposition, an anger that seemed deeply personal and potentially dangerous. The stage was set for the final demonstration of the day. Past and present were converging in ways none of them could fully anticipate, building toward a moment of reckoning that had been decades in the making. The Blue Angels ready room at Miramar buzzed with pre-flight activity as pilots conducted final briefings and ground crews prepared for the day's demonstration. Commander Sarah Reyes stood at the center of the activity when she noticed Peg enter with Admiral Morrison. "Captain Calloway," she called, breaking away from the group. "I didn't expect to see you here today." Peg smiled. "A change of plans. I've decided to accept your invitation to observe the demonstration from the flight line." Reyes's expression brightened. "That's fantastic. The team will be honored to have you with us." "I have one request," Peg added. "I'd like to see the pre-flight briefing for the special demonstration sequence, the one incorporating the modified G-force management techniques." "Of course," Reyes agreed readily. "Would you like to address the team directly about the techniques?" Peg hadn't anticipated this opportunity. "I'd be honored." Reyes led them to the briefing area where the demonstration team had gathered. The pilots, in their distinctive blue flight suits, turned with interest as Peg was introduced. "Captain Calloway has agreed to discuss the G-force management techniques we'll be demonstrating today," Reyes announced. "These techniques were originally developed by the captain during her active service years, though they've been refined and formalized since then." Peg stepped forward. "The techniques you'll be demonstrating today weren't developed in a laboratory or through formal research," she began. "They were born of necessity in the cockpit under combat conditions. When the standard AGSM techniques proved inadequate for my physiological responses, I had to adapt or fail." The pilots listened with evident interest. The key insight was recognizing that G-tolerance isn't just about strength, but about coordinated physiological response. By modifying the muscle engagement sequence and breathing pattern to account for individual baseline characteristics, even pilots with supposedly marginal G-tolerance could achieve exceptional performance. A female pilot raised her hand. "Ma'am, when you first developed these techniques, did you anticipate they would become standard training for future generations?" Peg smiled at the question. "Not remotely. I was focused on the immediate challenge, staying conscious at 9GS in a combat environment. The fact that my personal adaptations eventually evolved into formal methodology, that was an unexpected legacy." "But an important one," the pilot added. "Without your techniques, many of us might never have qualified for fighter roles, myself included." The sentiment was echoed by nods from several other pilots. Peg felt an unexpected surge of emotion at this acknowledgement, not from official Navy recognition, but from the pilots whose careers her work had directly impacted. "Thank you for that perspective," she said. "I'm glad the techniques have made a difference." As the briefing concluded and the pilots dispersed, Reyes approached Peg again. "What would you say to joining me in the announce booth during the demonstration? When we perform the special sequence, you could provide technical commentary explaining the physiological aspects to the audience." The suggestion caught Peg off guard. That would be quite public. "Exactly," Reyes replied with a meaningful look. "An opportunity to begin acknowledging your contributions openly, not just within aviation circles but to the general public." Morrison smiled encouragingly. "Your call, Peg, but it seems appropriate given recent developments." After a moment's consideration, Peg nodded. "I'll do it." The crowd's excited murmur rose as the Blue Angels formation taxied into position for the afternoon's main demonstration. In the VIP section, Peg watched with professional interest, automatically noting details about the aircraft's alignment and the precision of the ground cruise movements. "They've made some changes to the demonstration sequence this year," Fletcher commented beside her. "More emphasis on tactical capability, less on pure aerobatics." Peg nodded, reflecting the evolving mission profile. "Smart." Before long, the announcer's voice boomed across the airfield. "Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the runway for the final demonstration of the day. The United States Navy Blue Angels will now present their full tactical demonstration." The 6 blue and gold aircraft began their takeoff sequence, each fighter lifting into the clear California sky with precision timing. The crowd applauded as the formation climbed. Peg felt the familiar tightening in her chest that she always experienced watching aircraft in flight, a complex mixture of appreciation, nostalgia, and the phantom sensation of G-forces she would never feel again. Her hands rested on the arms of her chair, fingers unconsciously twitching with the control inputs she would have made if she were at the stick. "Here comes the third sequence," Fletcher murmured, leaning forward slightly. The formation split, with 4 aircraft holding in a diamond pattern while 2 peeled away for a separate demonstration. The announcer's voice explained, "Ladies and gentlemen, Commanders Reyes and Martinez will now demonstrate the extreme performance envelope of the FA-18 Super Hornet, including high-G tactical maneuvers developed through the Navy's ongoing research into human performance under stress." Peg's attention sharpened at this description. The 2 aircraft climbed rapidly, then entered a sequence of maneuvers that she recognized immediately, not standard Blue Angels choreography, but adaptations of combat tactics she herself had pioneered during the Gulf War. The very techniques she had developed to maximize the FA-18's capabilities while managing extreme G-forces. "Those are your maneuvers," Fletcher said quietly. "The Callaway sequence." Peg nodded, momentarily speechless as she watched her innovations performed with flawless precision by pilots who had likely never heard her name in any official capacity. The announcer continued, "These maneuvers represent the evolution of naval aviation tactics over 3 decades, incorporating lessons learned during conflicts from Desert Storm to the present day. The techniques you're witnessing allow our pilots to maintain peak performance even under extreme physical stress." It wasn't an explicit acknowledgement, but it was more than Peg had expected, a subtle but clear reference to the historical lineage of the maneuvers. As the sequence concluded, Morrison touched her arm gently. Commander Reyes made some adjustments to the standard announcement script, nothing that would raise eyebrows at the Pentagon, but enough to acknowledge the lineage. "It's more than I expected," Peg admitted, surprisingly moved. It's the least they could do, Fletcher added, though still far less than you deserve. The Blue Angels completed their demonstration with their signature Delta formation flyover, 6 aircraft perfectly aligned as they thundered above the crowd. The spectators erupted in applause, rising to their feet. As the applause began to fade, Peg became aware of a commotion near the edge of the VIP section. Tommy Lawton had returned, evading security to position himself where he could be seen and heard. "You're celebrating a lie," he shouted. "These women aren't real combat pilots. They're publicity stunts. Ask Margaret Calloway about Baghdad. Ask her about the real record." Security personnel moved quickly toward him, firmly escorting him away. As they let him past the VIP section, his eyes locked with Peg's for a brief moment, filled with a hatred so personal it took her aback. "He knows something," she murmured, "something specific." Morrison had joined them. "Do you recognize him now?" Peg shook her head slowly. "No, but he seems to know me, or think he does." After the incident, Commander Reyes approached, her expression shifting from excitement to concern as she sensed the tension. "Is everything all right?" "Just an overzealous critic," Morrison assured her. "Nothing to worry about. Excellent flying, by the way." Reyes brightened but kept her gaze on Peg. "What did you think, Captain? Did you recognize your own work up there?" Despite her lingering unease about Lawton, Peg couldn't help but smile at the young pilot's enthusiasm. "I did. You flew it beautifully. Better than I ever did, if I'm being honest." "I doubt that," Reyes replied with genuine respect. "There's more," Reyes continued, her expression brightening. "We're launching an official historical research project on the early female combat pilots, particularly those who flew before the combat exclusion laws were lifted. The Navy has authorized full access to declassified mission reports from Desert Storm." Peg's interest sharpened, including the redacted sections. "Some of them, yes," Reyes confirmed. "The 30-year classification period has expired for most Gulf War records. We're hoping to finally document the full story of women in combat aviation, including your contributions." "I'm still inclined to participate," Peg said. "Though I want to be clear, if I participate, I'll insist on complete historical accuracy, regardless of who it might implicate or what policies it might reveal were violated." Reyes nodded without hesitation. "That's exactly what we want, Captain, the unvarnished truth wherever it leads." They exchanged contact information, and Reyes promised to forward the project documentation within the week. As Reyes departed to attend to her squadron duties, Peg turned back to Fletcher. "There's something I need to ask you directly," she said. "Why are you suddenly so invested in this? You were content to let the record lie for over 30 years." Fletcher had the grace to look genuinely ashamed. "Because there's more to the Baghdad story than you know, Peg, more than I've told you." Peg's full attention focused on him. "I'm listening." Fletcher took a deep breath. "You were never supposed to be flying lead that day. It violated explicit orders from theater command about female pilots in combat roles. When the original flight lead came down sick an hour before mission time, I made the call to put you in the lead position. Not command. Me. I knew you were the best pilot available, and I made a judgment call, knowing it violated standing orders." Peg absorbed this information. "So all these years," she said finally, her voice deliberately even, "when you expressed regret that my actions weren't properly acknowledged, you neglected to mention that you were directly responsible for that omission." Fletcher winced but nodded. "Yes. When you saved my life, I couldn't acknowledge your actions officially without admitting that I had knowingly violated direct orders. So I let your contribution go unrecognized. Worse, I accepted a distinguished flying cross for bringing my damaged aircraft home, a feat that was only possible because of you." The revelation hung between them. "Why tell me now, David, after 34 years?" "Because you deserve the truth. Because this historical research project may uncover it anyway, and because Lawton's outburst suggests he may already know." Peg's eyes narrowed. "You're still protecting yourself." Fletcher couldn't meet her gaze. "Partly, yes, but also because carrying this secret has become unbearable. Seeing you today, hearing those young pilots talk about the Callaway methods while not knowing the full extent of what you did in combat, it's wrong. It's always been wrong." Peg studied him for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "I appreciate your honesty, belated though it is, but I need time to process this." "Of course," Fletcher agreed. "That's not your decision to make," Peg replied coolly. "Just as it wasn't your decision alone to erase my contributions from the record." Without waiting for his response, Peg turned and walked away, her posture military straight despite the subtle limp that decades-old injuries had left her with. She made her way toward the hangar exit, needing fresh air and solitude to process this new information. The bright California sunlight outside the hangar was almost blinding. Peg paused, allowing her eyes to adjust while gathering her thoughts. "Captain Callaway." The voice came from behind her. Peg turned to find Tommy Lawton standing a few yards away, his posture tense but controlled. "Mr. Lawton," she acknowledged, instantly alert. "I believe security made it clear you were to leave the premises." "They're watching the admirals, not the exits," Lawton replied. "I needed to speak with you directly, away from your protectors." Peg assessed him quickly. He was unarmed as far as she could tell, and despite his evident hostility, he maintained a non-threatening distance. Every instinct warned her to be cautious. "What do you want, Mr. Lawton? I don't believe we've met." "We haven't," he confirmed. "But I know you, Captain. I know what really happened over Baghdad on January 17, 1991. The specificity of the date sent a chill through Peg. Few people outside the mission participants would know the exact date of that particular operation. "How would you have access to classified mission details?" she asked, keeping her voice level. "My father was Colonel Richard Lawton, S.R., he said, watching her face closely for recognition. "Deputy Air Group Commander during Desert Storm. He oversaw the investigation into mission protocols following the Baghdad operation." Peg maintained her neutral expression, though internally she was rapidly connecting dots. Colonel Lawton had indeed been involved in the post-mission review, a stern, by-the-book officer who had made his opposition to women in combat roles well known. "I see," she said carefully. "And what is it you believe you know about that mission?" Lawton's expression hardened. "I know that you violated direct orders by flying a combat lead position. I know that Admiral Fletcher, then Captain Fletcher, covered it up to save his own career. And I know that my father was forced into early retirement for attempting to bring these violations to light." Peg processed this new information carefully. If that's true, it was a matter for the military justice system at the time. Why confront me now, 34 years later? "Because the lies are still being perpetuated," Lawton said, his voice rising slightly. "Today they're celebrating techniques you developed while violating direct orders. My father's career was destroyed for upholding those policies, while you and Fletcher escaped accountability." Now Peg understood the personal nature of his grudge. Tommy Lawton wasn't just an ideological opponent of women in combat roles. He was a son seeking vindication for a father whose career had apparently been sacrificed in the political aftermath of her mission. "I'm sorry about your father's career," Peg said sincerely. But I was a naval officer following the orders I was given. If there were higher-level policy violations, those were not my decisions to make. Yet you benefited from them, Lawton countered, while my father paid the price for integrity. Before Peg could respond, Morrison's voice called from the hangar entrance. Peg, everything all right? Lawton stepped back, his expression closing. This isn't over, Captain Calloway. The truth deserves to be known, all of it, not just the convenient parts. He turned and walked quickly away, disappearing around the corner of the building before Morrison could identify him. Morrison approached rapidly. Was that Lawton? What did he say to you? Peg was still processing the encounter. He's Colonel Richard Lawton's son, she explained. Apparently his father was forced into retirement for trying to expose protocol violations during Desert Storm, including my role as combat lead on the Baghdad mission. Morrison's expression darkened. Did Fletcher know who he was? I don't know, Peg admitted, but I intend to find out. The VIP reception was winding down, the crowd thinning as dignitaries and military personnel departed for other commitments. Morrison had drawn Fletcher aside and was speaking with him in a low, direct tone when Peg approached. Something you'd like to tell me, David? She asked. Fletcher looked at Morrison, who gave him a single, firm nod. Fletcher sighed. Colonel Lawton wasn't forced into retirement solely for attempting to enforce combat exclusion policies, he said. His investigation went well beyond proper channels. He attempted to use the Baghdad mission as leverage in a broader campaign against female integration in aviation roles, a campaign that included leaking classified information to sympathetic congressional staffers. How convenient that his supposed offenses aligned so perfectly with justifying his removal, Peg replied. I'm not asking you to take my word for it, Fletcher countered. The documentation exists in the archived investigations. And you're only mentioning this now because until today, I had no idea his son was still carrying that grudge, Fletcher admitted. I never connected Tommy Lawton, the airshow protester, with Colonel Lawton from Desert Storm. Peg studied him, assessing his sincerity. Despite her anger, her years of experience in military command made her practical about evaluating information, regardless of its source. If what you're saying is true, it would explain the son's intensity, she acknowledged reluctantly. But it doesn't excuse your own actions, David. Fletcher had the grace to look genuinely ashamed. I know, there is no adequate excuse. I can only say that I deeply regret my actions, both then and in all the years since when I could have spoken up but didn't. I'll be participating in Commander Reyes's historical research project, Peg said finally. The complete truth about the Baghdad mission and its aftermath will be part of that record, including your role in both assigning me to the mission and then covering it up afterward. Fletcher paled slightly but nodded. As it should be, I'll cooperate fully. Whatever consequences come from that, I'll accept them. Peg studied him for a long moment, then nodded once sharply. Good, because the truth isn't negotiable, David. Not anymore. As the reception concluded, Peg found herself reflecting on the day's unexpected developments. She had come to the airshow seeking nothing more than a quiet connection to her past. Instead, she had found herself thrust back into the complex politics and personal dynamics of a history she had thought long settled. Yet amid the discomfort and the reopened wounds, there was something else. A sense of possibilities previously foreclosed now reopening, the chance for her contributions to be acknowledged, the opportunity for the full truth to emerge, not as personal vindication but as historical accuracy. As Peg prepared to depart, Commander Reyes approached one final time, extending a small, carefully wrapped package. "A token of appreciation, Captain, from the squadron." Peg unwrapped it to find a perfectly crafted miniature of an FA-18 Hornet, painted in the colors of her old squadron, VFA-81. On its tail fin, barely visible except on close inspection, was her callsign, Wildcat. "How did you know?" Peg asked, genuinely moved. "Research," Ray smiled. "Your callsign appears in a few unofficial squadron documents from that period. We thought you should have this." The gesture was unexpectedly powerful. After decades of feeling her contributions had been erased, this small acknowledgement, a tangible recognition of her identity as a naval aviator, reached Peg in a way that formal accolades might not have. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice not quite steady. As Peg left the reception, the miniature Hornet carefully secured in her purse, she found herself looking forward rather than backward for the first time in years. Whatever came of the historical research, whatever truths emerged about Baghdad and its aftermath, she had received something today she had long ago stopped expecting. The recognition of her peers, not as a female pilot but simply as a pilot, judged by the same standards of excellence that had always driven her. It wasn't complete justice. It wasn't perfect recognition. But perhaps, after all this time, it was enough to begin healing wounds she had carried for decades. 2 days after the airshow, Peg sat in her modest apartment overlooking San Diego Bay, reviewing the detailed documentation Commander Reyes had sent regarding the historical research project. The scope was impressive, far more comprehensive than Peg had expected, with Navy authorization for access to previously classified mission reports, personal interviews with surviving pilots and commanders, and institutional support for publishing the findings without political interference. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Margaret Calloway," she answered. "Captain Calloway, this is James Morrison. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Hawk. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to update you on a situation that's developed since the airshow. My intelligence contacts have completed a preliminary background check on Tommy Lawton. And it's concerning," Morrison replied. "Lawton has a history of increasingly radical anti-integration views. In recent months, his rhetoric has become more extreme. He specifically referenced exposing the lies of Desert Storm and has made veiled references to classified information he claims to possess." "How would he have access to classified information about missions his father investigated?" Peg asked. "Colonel Lawton apparently maintained personal records of his investigations, despite regulations prohibiting such practices. After his death 3 years ago, those records presumably passed to his son." "That's a security violation," Peg noted. "It is. Naval intelligence is taking it seriously." Morrison paused. "There's something else. Fletcher has submitted a formal statement to the Naval Historical Center, acknowledging his role in assigning you to the Baghdad mission and the subsequent cover-up. He's also requested that his Distinguished Flying Cross citation be amended to acknowledge your role in enabling his aircraft's return." "This was unexpected. That's surprising," Peg admitted. "He's serious about making amends," Morrison said. "For what it's worth, I believe his regret is genuine. Too late, perhaps, but genuine nonetheless." After concluding the call, Peg's contemplation was interrupted by another call from Commander Reyes. "Captain Calloway, we've had an unexpected development. Tommy Lawton has contacted our research team, claiming to have primary documents from Desert Storm that contradict official records, specifically regarding the Baghdad mission. He's offering them in exchange for being interviewed as part of our research." "And your response?" Peg asked carefully. I wanted to consult with you before proceeding, Reyes replied. If he genuinely has relevant documentation, it could be valuable to our research. But given his obvious bias and the potentially illegal nature of his possession of classified materials, I'm hesitant to engage. If you do decide to review what he has, it should be done through proper channels, Peg advised. Naval intelligence should be involved to assess any classified materials, and his participation should be contingent on full disclosure, not cherry-picked documents that support his narrative. That was my thinking as well, Reyes agreed. One more thing, Peg added. Leave the door open for a direct conversation between Lawton and me. I think that might be the most effective way to resolve this. After ending the call, Peg moved to the window of her apartment, gazing out at the naval vessels in the distance. Her phone chimed with an incoming message, a formal invitation from the Naval Historical Center to participate in a preliminary interview for the research project the following week. Peg typed her acceptance without hesitation. The truth, as she had told Fletcher, wasn't negotiable, not anymore. Naval Air Station Oceana, Virginia Beach, Virginia, September 15, 1998. The MRI results are conclusive, Captain, Dr. Alina Phillips said, pointing to the scan displayed on the light board. You have herniated discs at C5, C6, and C6, C7, with significant spinal stenosis and nerve impingement. Peg studied the images, the clinical evidence of damage that had been developing over years of high-G flying. The pain had become impossible to ignore in recent months, shooting down her left arm and causing numbness in her fingers, the hand that controlled the throttle. "What's the prognosis?" she asked, maintaining her professional composure despite the sinking feeling in her stomach. Dr. Phillips hesitated. "Without intervention, the nerve impingement will worsen. You're already experiencing strength loss in your left hand. With your current symptoms, I can't clear you for flight status." The words hit Peg like a physical blow, though she had been anticipating them since the symptoms had first appeared. 14 years as a fighter pilot, thousands of hours pulling GS in the cockpit, had taken a toll that could no longer be ignored. "What are the treatment options?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil beneath. "Surgery is indicated," Dr. Phillips replied. "Anterior cervical discectomy and fusion. Success rates are good, but recovery time is significant, 3 to 6 months. And even with optimal results, return to high-performance aircraft piloting would be extremely unlikely. The fusion would restrict neck mobility, and the risk of re-injury under G-forces would be too high." "Non-surgical alternatives," Peg pressed. "Physical therapy and pain management can help manage symptoms, but they won't reverse the structural damage, and they're unlikely to return you to flight status given the nature of fighter piloting." In her office that afternoon, Commander Robert Harris sat waiting. "Bad news?" he asked. "Cervical herniation and stenosis," Peg confirmed. "Restricted flight status pending further decisions about treatment." "I'm sorry, Peg. I know what flying means to you." "What are my options, Bob, realistically?" Harris sighed. "Staff position at the Pentagon, training command, Naval War College, all respectable career continuations. But not flying." The unspoken reality hung between them. "And if I want to stay connected to actual aviation," Peg pressed. Harris considered this. There might be a possibility. The Navy's developing new training protocols for G-force management, particularly with the integration of more female pilots. Your experience in both flying and in developing modified AGSM techniques could be valuable there, not just classroom theory, but actual practical application working with flight surgeons and physiologists. It wasn't flying, but it was adjacent to it, using her hard-won knowledge to improve the capabilities of current and future pilots. There was meaning in that. "I'd like to explore that option," she said. If she could no longer fly combat missions herself, perhaps her legacy would be the pilots who could, armed with knowledge she had pioneered. It wasn't the future she had envisioned, but it was a future with purpose. And for Margaret Calloway, purpose had always been the driving force. Naval Air Station, Patuxent River, Maryland, 3 months later. "Again," Peg instructed, watching the young pilot in the human centrifuge through the monitoring window. "Focus on sequential muscle activation, starting with the legs and moving upward. And modify your breathing cadence, speed up during the initial G onset, then stabilize." Lieutenant Jessica Chen nodded, determination evident in her expression, despite the fatigue of repeated high-G exposures. She was one of 6 pilot candidates participating in the experimental training program PEG had developed, specialized techniques for G tolerance optimized for different body types and physiological responses, with particular attention to addressing the challenges faced by female aviators. The centrifuge began its run, gradually increasing the G-forces. 7GS and holding, the technician announced. Physiological readings stable. Chen's voice came through the communication system, strained but controlled. Vision clear, no tunnel effect. "Excellent," Peg encouraged. "Maintain for 30 seconds, then we'll increase to 8. After the session concluded, Flight Surgeon Dr. Marcus Winters reviewed the data. "Her progress is remarkable," Winters observed. 6 weeks ago, she was blacking out at 7GS. Now she's maintaining full consciousness at 8 for 30 seconds. The modified techniques are clearly effective." Peg nodded. "The key is customization. The standard AGSM works for many pilots, but not optimally for all body types and physiologies. By tailoring the muscle engagement sequence and breathing patterns to individual baseline responses, we're seeing consistent improvements across all test subjects. Particularly notable in the female candidates," Winters added. "Their improvement metrics are outpacing the males in the program percentage-wise." "Because they had more room for improvement," Peg explained. "The standard techniques were developed primarily on male test subjects. They never accounted for differences in cardiovascular response patterns, muscle mass distribution, and pulmonary capacity." As Chen departed for her recovery period, Captain William Northrop, the program director, approached Peg. "I've received word from Naval Air Systems Command. They want to expand the program, integrate your modified techniques into the standard flight training curriculum." He paused. "And they're interested in establishing a permanent human performance optimization division within the training command. They want you to head it." The offer was unexpected but intriguing. It would mean a permanent transition away from operational flying roles, but it would also provide a platform to extend and formalize her work, potentially influencing an entire generation of naval aviators. That evening, Peg made her decision. She would accept the surgery, embrace the new role, and channel her experience and knowledge into developing the next generation of naval aviators. She would never again feel the unique exhilaration of pulling 9GS in an FA-18, but she would ensure that those who came after her had the best possible preparation for those experiences. She would transform her personal techniques from intuitive practices into formalized, teachable methodologies. It wasn't the future she had imagined, but it was a future with purpose and meaning. For Margaret Calloway, that had always been enough. Naval Air Systems Command, Patuxent River, Maryland, 2003. The key insight was recognizing that G tolerance isn't just about physical strength. Peg explained to the assembled group of flight surgeons, physiologists, and training officers. It's about coordinated physiological responses tailored to individual baseline characteristics. On the large screen behind her, data visualizations showed the comparative results of pilots trained using standard AGSM techniques versus those using the modified protocols she had developed over the past 5 years. The differences were striking. Average G tolerance increased by 23%, recovery times reduced by 17%, and most significantly, the gender gap in performance metrics narrowed to statistical insignificance. What we're seeing is the elimination of artificial performance limitations, Peg continued. The standard techniques, developed primarily on male test subjects in the 1970s and 80s, created an unintentional bias in our training systems. By recognizing and accounting for physiological diversity, we've unlocked capabilities that were always present but previously untapped. The questions from the assembled group continued for nearly an hour. Peg addressed each with the confidence of someone who had thoroughly tested her approach and the humility of a researcher who recognized that further refinements were always possible. As the session concluded, Admiral James Peterson, the program's senior sponsor, approached Peg. "Impressive presentation, Captain. You've turned personal necessity into institutional innovation. Not many officers can claim that kind of impact." "Thank you, sir," Peg replied. "But the real test will be full implementation across all training commands." Peterson nodded. "Your program has been highlighted in the quarterly readiness review. The CNO specifically mentioned the potential for your methodology to address long-standing G-tolerance disparities." He paused. "For what it's worth, Captain, your innovations deserve to be properly attributed. Proper attribution creates institutional memory, ensures continuity beyond any individual's tenure." Peg considered this perspective. She had become so accustomed to her contributions being minimized or unacknowledged that she had stopped expecting otherwise. But Peterson had a point. "I'll take that under advisement, sir," she said. Later that afternoon, Lieutenant Commander Chen appeared in the doorway. "Captain, I just wanted to thank you before I ship out. I received my assignment to VFA 41, the Black Aces, FA 18E Super Hornets." Peg smiled warmly. "Congratulations, Commander. That's an excellent squadron. When do you report?" 3 weeks. I'll be the first female pilot in the unit," Chen added, a mixture of pride and apprehension in her voice. "They're getting an exceptional aviator," Peg assured her. Chen's expression turned earnest. "Ma'am, I've been telling everyone about your program, but when I looked for official documentation to share, I couldn't find your name anywhere. The techniques are described in the new training manuals, but they're not called the Callaway method or anything similar." Peg wasn't surprised, but she appreciated Chen's concern. "Captain, with respect, attribution matters," Chen said with the directness of a junior officer who hadn't yet learned political caution. "It matters that it was a female combat pilot who recognized the physiological challenges and developed solutions. That history shouldn't be lost." Peg studied the younger woman, seeing in her the same determination and principled commitment that had driven her own career. "Perhaps you're right," Peg acknowledged. "Among those of us who have been through your program," Chen added, "the techniques are absolutely known as the Callaway method. That's what we call them, regardless of what the official manuals say." It was a small comfort, but a meaningful one. Like the Wildcat callsign that had once acknowledged her skills in the cockpit, this informal recognition among pilots carried a weight that official designations might not. "Thank you for telling me that, Commander," Peg said sincerely, "and for your commitment to carrying the methodology forward. That's the most important form of continuity." After Chen departed, Peg returned to her office. The work continued, regardless of official acknowledgement, and with pilots like Chen entering operational squadrons, the impact would multiply far beyond what any individual attribution could capture. It wasn't the legacy she had envisioned when she first entered flight training 2 decades earlier, but it was a legacy with depth and meaning, one that would influence naval aviation long after her own service concluded. For now, that was enough. Tommy Lawton stood at the edge of the VIP viewing area, his posture rigid with barely contained anger. From this position, he could observe the interactions inside the reception tent where Admiral Morrison, Admiral Fletcher, and Margaret Calloway continued their conversations with the Blue Angels pilots and other distinguished guests. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "They'll never acknowledge what they did, Tommy. The system protects its own, buries its mistakes, and sacrifices those who speak up." Colonel Richard Lawton SR had spent the last years of his life bitter and resentful, his promising military career cut short after he attempted to expose what he saw as flagrant violations of combat exclusion policies during Desert Storm. A decorated officer who had served honorably through the Cold War, he had died still believing he had been wronged, a conviction he had passed to his son with the fervor of religious faith. And along with that conviction, he had passed on something else, a collection of personal files, mission reports, and investigation notes that he had maintained despite regulations prohibiting the retention of classified materials. Documents that detailed the Baghdad mission and its aftermath, including the deliberate falsification of official records to conceal Margaret Calloway's role. Lawton's hand tightened around the flash drive in his pocket. Everything was there, the evidence his father had collected, the names, the dates, the violations of direct orders, and the subsequent cover-up. Then the announcement of the historical research project had appeared in a military aviation journal, a Navy-sponsored initiative to document the role of female aviators in combat operations before the official policy changes. Lawton had seen it for what it was, an attempt to rewrite history, to cast pioneers like Calloway as heroes, rather than rule breakers who had undermined military discipline and tradition. Security personnel were watching him. He had already made his opening move by contacting the research team. Now he would wait to see how they responded. His phone vibrated with an incoming message. An email from Commander Reyes' office. "Mr. Lawton, thank you for your offer to share documents related to our research project. We would be interested in reviewing any materials you have, provided they are shared through appropriate official channels. Please contact Naval Intelligence Officer Commander Wilson at the attached secure number to arrange proper handling of any classified information." Lawton's mouth tightened. Official channels, the very system his father had tried to work through, only to be silenced and sidelined. He typed a reply. "The documents will be made available publicly if not properly acknowledged in your research. The truth deserves to be known." Inside the reception tent, Peg was engaged in conversation with Commander Reyes when the young officer's phone chimed. Reyes checked it, her expression shifting subtly as she read. "Is everything all right, Commander?" Peg asked. Reyes passed it to her. Peg read Lawton's message, her mind rapidly assessing implications. The message wasn't explicitly threatening, but the subtext was clear. Cooperate on his terms or risk having sensitive information released publicly. "He's bluffing," Fletcher said. "If he had anything truly damaging, he would have released it already." "I'm not so sure," Peg replied. "His father was the investigating officer for the Baghdad mission. He might well have maintained personal records." Morrison joined them. "This crosses a line. Threatening to release potentially classified information is a federal offense. We should involve naval intelligence immediately. Escalating to a formal intelligence investigation might provoke him into hasty action, Peg said. If he truly possesses sensitive documents, better to engage constructively than back him into a corner. You want to meet with him, Morrison said, reading her intent. I want to understand what he actually has and what he wants, Peg clarified. Lawton believes his father was wronged. That grievance is 3 decades old but still raw for him. There might be a way to address it that satisfies his sense of justice without compromising operational security or personal reputations. It's risky, Morrison said. He's demonstrated passion, Peg corrected, and his anger isn't entirely without foundation. If his father was indeed forced out for attempting to enforce policies that others were violating with impunity, that's a legitimate grievance, regardless of our views on the policies themselves. What would you suggest? Fletcher asked. Let me talk to him, Peg said simply. One-on-one. No security, no intimidation, just a conversation. Absolutely not, Fletcher and Morrison responded almost in unison. Peg's expression hardened. I wasn't asking permission, gentlemen. I'm telling you my intention. This situation needs to be de-escalated, not intensified. Morrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. You never did learn to back down from a fight, did you, Peg? Not when it matters, she replied. And understanding the full truth of what happened during Desert Storm, it matters. Not just for me or for Lawton, but for the historical record. If we do this, Fletcher said carefully, it has to be somewhere secure. Security present but not visible, and you need to be wired in case things go sideways. Reasonable precautions, Peg agreed. But I speak with him alone. No interference unless there's a clear threat. Reyes sent Lawton a message offering a meeting. The response came less than 2 minutes later. Oceanside Pier, 8 p.m., come alone. Peg nodded satisfied. I'll be there. The Oceanside Pier stretched nearly 1,950 feet into the Pacific, one of the longest wooden piers on the West Coast. At 8 p.m., it was still populated with evening fishermen, couples enjoying the sunset, and tourists taking in the ocean views. Peg had arrived early, positioning herself midway along the pier. Morrison and a small team from naval intelligence were dispersed throughout the area, maintaining communication via discreet earpieces. Fletcher had been persuaded to remain behind. Peg had dressed casually, jeans and a navy windbreaker, nothing that would draw attention. She looked like any other visitor enjoying the evening sea air. At precisely 8 p.m., she spotted Lawton walking toward her from the pier entrance. He moved with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to purpose. He approached and stopped a respectful distance away. Captain Calloway, he acknowledged. Mr. Lawton, Peg replied evenly. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I'm surprised you came alone, he said, glancing around suspiciously. We both know I'm not completely alone, Peg responded candidly. But this conversation is between us. No one will interfere unless they have reason to believe I'm in danger. Lawton's mouth tightened. I'm not a threat to you, Captain, despite what your admirals might think. I never believed you were, Peg assured him. Angry, yes, determined, certainly, but not dangerous. This frank assessment seemed to catch Lawton off guard. He had clearly expected defensiveness or intimidation, not this calm directness. You want to know what documents I have, he said after a moment. I do, Peg confirmed. But more importantly, I want to understand what you hope to achieve by sharing them, what justice looks like from your perspective. Lawton hadn't expected this question either. He looked out toward the darkening ocean, gathering his thoughts. My father was a career officer, he began. 30 years of service, decorated officer, Deputy Air Group Commander during Desert Storm. He believed in the system, in the chain of command, in following orders even when he personally disagreed with them. Peg listened silently, allowing him the space to tell his story. When he discovered unauthorized combat missions being flown by female pilots, he didn't immediately raise alarms. He followed protocol, documented the incidents, prepared reports for his superiors. He assumed they would want to know that direct orders were being violated. Lawton's expression hardened. Instead, he was shut down, told to bury his findings. When he persisted, suggesting that discipline was being undermined by selective enforcement of policies, he was labeled a troublemaker. Within 6 months, he was passed over for promotion, then encouraged to retire. Peg nodded slowly, and the Baghdad mission was part of what he documented. It was the most egregious example, Lawton confirmed. A female pilot, not authorized for combat operations, assigned as flight lead on a high-risk mission by a commander who knew it violated direct orders. Then when the mission went wrong, a deliberate falsification of records to conceal those violations, while the commander in question received decoration for his actions. Peg noted that Lawton didn't specifically identify her as the pilot or Fletcher as the commander, a small but significant indication that this wasn't purely personal for him. Your father believed he was upholding proper military discipline, Peg observed. That selective enforcement of policies, whatever their merits, undermined the integrity of the system. Exactly, Lawton said, surprised by her understanding. It was never about whether women should fly combat missions. It was about officers choosing which orders to follow and which to ignore, then covering up those decisions when convenient. Peg considered this perspective carefully. There was merit to his father's position, viewed from that angle. The combat exclusion policies had been legally binding at the time, regardless of their wisdom. Officers who selectively violated them and then concealed those violations had indeed undermined military discipline in a technical sense. "What documents do you actually possess?" she asked directly. Lawton reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a flash drive. "Everything. My father's investigation notes, copies of original mission reports before the redactions, testimony from maintenance crews and support personnel who confirmed your role as flight lead, internal memos discussing how to handle the situation without creating political complications." "Those would have been classified materials," Peg noted. "Your father shouldn't have maintained personal copies." He knew that, Lawton acknowledged. But he also believed the system had failed in its obligation to uphold its own standards. He kept the documentation as insurance, though he never used it during his lifetime. "And now you're considering releasing it publicly," Peg stated, "to vindicate your father." "To expose the truth," Lawton corrected. "That's all he ever wanted. Recognition that he was pushed out for doing his job while others were rewarded for violating orders and covering up those violations." Peg took a deep breath of the salt-tanged air, organizing her thoughts. "Mr. Lawton, I won't pretend to know whether your father was treated fairly. From what you've described, it sounds like he wasn't. But I can tell you this. Releasing classified information publicly won't bring him the vindication you're seeking. It would potentially harm many people, including those who had no role in the decisions that affected your father." Lawton's expression remained stubborn. The truth shouldn't be classified. "Perhaps not," Peg agreed. "But there are better ways to ensure the truth is acknowledged. Commander Reyes' research project. It has official Navy backing and security clearances to review classified materials. If your father's documents were submitted through proper channels, They could inform a more complete historical record without violating security laws. And be buried again, Lawton said skeptically, edited to protect reputations. Not if I'm involved, Peg stated firmly. I have a personal stake in ensuring the full truth is documented, Mr. Lawton. Not just about the Baghdad mission, but about all the female pilots who flew combat operations before the official policy changes. The good and the bad, the successes and the mistakes, the protocols followed and those violated. Lawton studied her, assessing her sincerity. Why should I trust you? You benefited from the very violations my father tried to expose. I flew the missions I was assigned, Peg corrected. But I've lived with the consequences of having my contributions erased from the official record. I understand something about injustice, Mr. Lawton, and about the importance of historical accuracy. She continued, her voice steady and resolute. I can't promise that your father will be portrayed as a hero in the final historical record, but I can promise that his perspective will be included, his concerns documented, the context of his actions presented fairly. The truth is rarely simple or comfortable for anyone involved. Lawton remained silent, considering her words. The deep-seated anger warred visibly with a desire for legitimate resolution. What guarantee do I have? He asked finally. My word, Peg replied simply. And this, I'll insist on being shown all materials submitted through the program, including your father's documents. I'll verify personally that they've been reviewed and incorporated into the research findings. And I'll ensure you receive a copy of the final report so you can see for yourself how the information was handled. It was a significant commitment, one that would require Peg to maintain direct involvement with the historical project regardless of any personal discomfort with revisiting the past. But it was a commitment she was prepared to make. Lawton seemed to recognize the authenticity of her offer. His posture relaxed slightly, the rigid anger that had defined his bearing throughout their encounter softening into something more contemplative. My father deserved better, he said, his voice quieter now. Many people did, Peg acknowledged. The past can't be changed, Mr. Lawton, but it can be honestly confronted. After a moment of continued deliberation, Lawton extended his hand, offering the flash drive. I have copies, he said, a final hint of caution in his voice. I would expect nothing less, Peg replied as she accepted the device. But I hope you'll give us the opportunity to handle this properly before considering other options. Lawton nodded once sharply, then turned to leave. He paused after a few steps. He wasn't wrong about the principle, you know. Whatever anyone thinks about the policy itself, selective enforcement undermines the entire system. I understand that perspective better than you might think, Peg said. The rule of law depends on consistent application, even when individual rules may be flawed. With a final acknowledging nod, Lawton continued walking, disappearing into the evening crowd. Peg remained where she stood, the flash drive heavy in her hand despite its small size, weighted with 34 years of hidden history. Morrison approached a few minutes later. That went better than expected. He gave it to you voluntarily. He did, Peg confirmed, in exchange for a commitment that the information will be properly reviewed and incorporated into the historical record, not buried again. A commitment you're prepared to honor. Absolutely, Peg replied without hesitation. Whatever these documents contain, they're part of the story, part of my story and Fletcher's and Colonel Lawton's, and all the other officers who made decisions, followed or violated orders, created or sustained policies during that period. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. You know that some careers could be damaged by full disclosure, even retrospectively. I do, Peg acknowledged. But history isn't served by continuing to conceal uncomfortable truths, and neither are the female aviators who have come after us, who deserve to know the complete story of how their opportunities were won. As they walked back along the pier toward the parking area, Peg found herself experiencing an unexpected sense of lightness. The prospect of finally confronting the full truth of her past wasn't entirely comfortable, but it was necessary, not just for her own peace of mind, but for the sake of historical accuracy and institutional honesty. Whatever revelations Lawton's documents might contain, Margaret Calloway was ready to face them. She had spent a career pushing boundaries and breaking barriers. She could handle a little more turbulence on the final approach to truth. The announcer's voice boomed across the airfield as the Blue Angels demonstration reached its midpoint. Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored to have with us today Captain Margaret Calloway, United States Navy, retired. Captain Calloway was among the first female combat pilots to fly the FA-18 Hornet and is the developer of advanced physiological training techniques still used by naval aviators today. A smattering of applause rose from the crowd as Peg joined the announcer in the elevated booth, overlooking the flight line. "What you're about to witness," she began, her voice clear and confident, "is more than just impressive aerobatics. These maneuvers demonstrate the extraordinary physical demands placed on fighter pilots and the specialized techniques they employ to maintain peak performance under extreme stress." The lead aircraft began a climbing spiral that tightened progressively, generating increasing G-forces. Peg explained the physics and physiology involved, translating technical concepts into terms the audience could understand. At 7 gs, the pilot's body weighs 7 times its normal amount. Blood that typically weighs about 12 pounds per gallon now weighs 84 pounds, making it extraordinarily difficult for the heart to pump effectively. Without specialized training and techniques, consciousness would fade within seconds as blood drains from the brain to pool in the lower extremities. The demonstration continued with a sequence of high-G maneuvers specifically designed to showcase the techniques Peg had pioneered. She provided ongoing commentary, explaining how the pilots were employing modified breathing patterns and muscle engagement sequences to maintain optimal cardiovascular function under stress. What makes naval aviation unique is not just the sophisticated aircraft or weapons systems, but the human element, the highly trained pilots who must function at peak cognitive and physical capacity, while their bodies are subjected to forces they were never designed to endure. As the sequence concluded to enthusiastic applause, Peg added, "These techniques have evolved significantly over the decades, refined through formal research and validated across thousands of flight hours. But they began in the cockpit, developed through necessity by pilots pushing the limits of human performance in operational environments." When she finished speaking, the applause intensified, a response not just to the aerial demonstration, but to Peg's insightful commentary, which had added depth and context to what might otherwise have been perceived as merely spectacular flying. Naval Historical Center, Washington, D.C., 6 months later. The conference room hummed with quiet conversation as attendees settled into their seats. The Naval Historical Center had convened this special symposium to present preliminary findings from the Women in Combat Aviation Research Project, bringing together participants, researchers, and select naval leadership for the first comprehensive review of the project's discoveries. Peg sat in the front row, her posture still military straight. Beside her was Commander Reyes, who had been elevated to project director after her initial research had expanded into a major historical initiative with unprecedented access to previously classified materials. Tommy Lawton was present, seated quietly at the back of the room. His cooperation had continued throughout the research process, evolving from initial hostility to cautious engagement as he witnessed the project's commitment to documenting all perspectives, including his father's concerns about policy enforcement. Vice Admiral Teresa Carlisle, the Navy's senior historian, called the meeting to order. "Good morning. Today marks a significant milestone in our ongoing effort to document the complete history of women's integration into naval combat aviation roles. This research has revealed that the path to integration was neither as smooth nor as policy-driven as previously portrayed. It was a complex process involving official directives and unofficial adaptations, policy pronouncements and practical necessities, institutional resistance and individual courage." Commander Reyes presented an overview of the project's key findings. "Our research has documented at least 17 female pilots who flew missions that could be classified as combat operations during Desert Storm, 2 years before the official policy change. These missions were generally omitted from official records or described in ways that obscured the pilots' roles. Slides displayed redacted mission reports alongside the original, unredacted versions, now declassified after 30 years, showing how female pilots' contributions had been systematically minimized or attributed to unnamed support aircraft. What emerges is a pattern of selective policy enforcement," Reyes continued. "Commanders made pragmatic decisions based on operational needs, utilizing all available skilled personnel regardless of gender, while maintaining the fiction of policy compliance in official documentation." When Reyes concluded, Vice Admiral Carlisle returned to the podium. "We'll now hear directly from Captain Calloway, whose experiences and innovations feature prominently in our findings." Peg rose and moved to the podium, surveying the assembled group of historians, officers, and project participants. "Thank you, Admiral Carlisle, Commander Reyes. It's somewhat surreal to hear one's career discussed as historical research. But time marches on, and yesterday's operational realities become today's historical analysis." She continued, her voice clear and steady. "I didn't set out to be a pioneer or an innovator. I simply wanted to fly the Navy's most challenging aircraft in the most demanding environments, to serve my country with the full measure of my capabilities. That this basic ambition placed me at the leading edge of institutional change was circumstantial, not intentional." Peg shared key moments from her career: the skepticism she had encountered during training, the physiological challenges she had overcome through adaptive techniques, the combat missions she had flown despite official prohibitions, and the subsequent minimization of those contributions in the official record. "What I hope emerges from this research," she emphasized, "is not just a more accurate accounting of individual contributions, but a more honest understanding of how institutional change actually occurs." She glanced toward the back of the room, where Tommy Lawton sat listening intently. "This research has also revealed legitimate concerns about selective policy enforcement during this transition period. Officers like Colonel Richard Lawton SR, who insisted on consistent application of existing directives regardless of their merits, raised valid questions about military discipline and the rule of law." Lawton straightened slightly at this acknowledgement, his expression suggesting surprise at hearing his father's perspective presented with such fairness. "The complete story includes multiple viewpoints, conflicting priorities, pragmatic compromises, and occasionally actions that violated direct orders," Peg continued. "What matters now is not assigning retrospective praise or blame, but documenting accurately how change occurred, with all its complications and contradictions." The applause that followed was thoughtful rather than merely polite. As Peg returned to her seat, She noted that even Lawton had joined in the acknowledgement. As the event adjourned, Lawton approached. "Captain Calloway," he said, extending his hand. "I wanted to thank you for your comments about my father's concerns. You presented his perspective fairly, which is more than I expected." Peg shook his hand firmly. "The complete story includes all perspectives, Mr. Lawton. Your father raised legitimate questions about selective enforcement of policies, regardless of one's view on the policies themselves." Lawton nodded, a complexity of emotions evident in his expression. "My father never opposed female pilots because he thought women weren't capable. He opposed inconsistent application of rules, the idea that some policies could be ignored while others were strictly enforced." "I understand that distinction now," Peg acknowledged. "And while I obviously disagreed with the combat exclusion laws themselves, I can respect the principle of consistent application of whatever rules are in place." It wasn't complete reconciliation. Their fundamental views still diverged significantly. But it was a recognition that historical truth was rarely black and white, that principled people could hold opposing views, and that honest documentation required acknowledging this complexity. Naval Air Museum, Pensacola, Florida, 1 year later. The new exhibit stood in a prominent position within the museum's modern naval aviation wing. Titled "Breaking Barriers: Women in Combat Aviation," it chronicled the evolution of female roles from support positions to full combat integration, with particular emphasis on the transition period during Desert Storm when operational realities had outpaced official policies. Peg walked slowly through the exhibit, studying the displays with careful attention. Photographs, mission reports, aircraft models, and interactive presentations documented the history she had lived through, now presented for public education and commemoration. A central section focused on physiological innovations, displaying the evolution of G-force management techniques with detailed explanations of the modifications that had eventually become known as the Calloway method. Peg's name and photograph featured prominently, alongside data visualizations demonstrating the effectiveness of her adaptations. Another area presented multiple perspectives on the policy transitions, including both advocacy for expanded female roles and principled concerns about selective enforcement of existing directives. Colonel Lawton's memoranda questioning the inconsistent application of combat exclusion policies were displayed alongside statements from commanders who had made pragmatic decisions based on operational needs. The exhibit didn't attempt to simplify this complex history or present a sanitized narrative of progress. Instead, it acknowledged the messy reality. That change had occurred through a combination of policy directives and practical necessities, official pronouncements and unofficial adaptations, institutional evolution and individual courage. Commander Reyes approached as Peg studied a display featuring the original unredacted mission reports. "What do you think?" Reyes asked. "It's remarkably comprehensive," Peg replied, "and admirably honest about the contradictions and complications involved." "That was our commitment," Reyes reminded her. "Historical accuracy rather than institutional narrative." Peg nodded appreciatively. The next generation deserves to understand how change really happens, not just the policy pronouncements, but the practical realities that often drive them. As they completed their tour, Peg noticed a group of young people entering the aviation wing, naval ROTC candidates on an organized educational visit. Among them was a young woman whose attentive expression reminded Peg of her younger self. Reyes noticed Peg's interest. "Would you like to speak with them?" "Yes," Peg decided. "I think that would be appropriate." After a brief introduction from their escort, The ROTC candidates gathered with evident excitement. "Good morning," Peg began. "I understand you're studying naval aviation history as part of your training. I'd be happy to provide some first-hand perspective on the transition period covered in this exhibit." The young woman raised her hand immediately. "Captain, what was the most significant challenge you faced as one of the first female combat pilots?" "The most significant challenge wasn't the flying itself," Peg answered. "It was maintaining focus on the mission while carrying the additional weight of knowing that my performance would be scrutinized not just as an individual pilot, but as a representative of all female aviators. Every success or failure would be generalized beyond my personal capabilities." The questions continued, ranging from technical inquiries to broader discussions about institutional change. Peg answered each thoughtfully, neither dramatizing nor minimizing her experiences. As the session concluded, the young woman approached Peg directly. "Captain Calloway, I'm planning to apply for flight training after commissioning. Your story is inspiring. Knowing what women like you accomplished, often without recognition at the time, makes me even more determined to earn my wings." Peg studied the young candidate. "What's your name?" "Midshipman Sophie Lawton, ma'am." Peg's eyebrows rose slightly at the surname. "Any relation to Colonel Richard Lawton, S.R.?" Sophie looked surprised. "Yes, ma'am. He was my grandfather. Did you know him?" "I never met him personally, but I've become familiar with his perspective through the historical research project. He raised important questions about policy enforcement during my era." Sophie nodded, seeming pleased by this acknowledgement. "My father told me about his involvement in the research project and how you ensured my grandfather's views were presented fairly. That meant a lot to our family." It was a moment of unexpected connection across generations and across what had once been opposing perspectives. The granddaughter of the officer who had questioned the legitimacy of female combat pilots was now herself aspiring to that very role, standing before one of the pioneers her grandfather had criticized. "The complete history includes all perspectives, Midshipman Lawton," Peg said. "Your grandfather's concerns about consistent policy application were valid, even if I disagreed with the policies themselves." Sophie's expression brightened. "My father says the exhibit here is the most honest presentation of that period he's ever seen, acknowledging both the policy issues and the practical realities." "That was our intention," Peg confirmed. "History is rarely simple or one-sided. Understanding its complexity helps us navigate present challenges more effectively." As Sophie rejoined her group, Peg reflected on the remarkable symmetry of the encounter. Richard Lawton's granddaughter, pursuing the very path her grandfather had questioned, finding inspiration in the story of a woman whose role he had once sought to challenge. Progress often moved in unexpected directions, reconciling what once seemed irreconcilable. Later, as Peg prepared to leave the museum, she paused for a final look at the exhibit. Her innovations were now properly documented for future generations. Her contributions, once deliberately obscured, were now presented in their historical context. The complete story, with all its complications and contradictions, was preserved. It wasn't the recognition she had sought as a young pilot. It was something more meaningful, the assurance that the lessons of her generation's experience, the successes and failures, the innovations and adaptations, the courage and persistence, would inform the path forward for those who followed. That was legacy enough. Peg sat on the small balcony of her San Diego apartment, watching the late afternoon light play across the bay. In the distance, naval vessels moved with purpose through the harbor, their silhouettes familiar and comforting after a lifetime connected to maritime aviation. The past 18 months had been unexpectedly eventful for a woman who had thought her career's most significant chapters were long concluded. What had begun as a simple desire to attend an airshow had evolved into a comprehensive re-examination of her past, a confrontation with long-buried conflicts, and ultimately a more complete reconciliation with her place in naval aviation history. The research project had been completed, its findings published in both scholarly and public formats. The museum exhibit had been installed. The techniques she had pioneered had been formally incorporated into training curricula, now officially designated as the Callaway method in recognition of their origins. On the table beside her lay an official letter from the Secretary of the Navy, informing her that the Naval Historical Center's Board of Review had recommended a retroactive amendment to her service record, acknowledging her combat missions during Desert Storm, and adding several commendations that had been withheld at the time for political reasons. The letter was accompanied by a note from Admiral Fletcher, handwritten and deeply personal. "Peg, I've spent 30 years regretting my silence about your contributions. This belated recognition can't undo that failure, but perhaps it can begin to address it. The truth matters, regardless of how long it takes to emerge. With profound respect, David." Peg had read the letter and note several times since their arrival that morning. The official acknowledgement, while meaningful, felt almost secondary now, an administrative correction to records that had long since ceased to define her sense of accomplishment or worth. More significant was the knowledge that the complete story was finally documented accurately for future generations. A knock at her apartment door interrupted her reflections. Peg rose to answer it, finding Commander Reyes standing in the hallway, dressed in civilian clothes. She carried a slim black case. "I hope I'm not intruding, Captain," Reyes said. "I'm in San Diego for a conference and wanted to deliver something personally." They settled in the living room. Reyes opened the case to reveal a beautifully crafted model of an FA-18 Hornet, painted in the colors of VFA-81, the Sunliner's, Peg's old squadron. Peg lifted the model carefully, noting the extraordinary attention to detail. The aircraft's tail fin bore her old call sign, Wildcat, and her name appeared beneath the canopy in the position where a pilot's name would typically be displayed. "It's a limited edition," Reyes explained. "The Foundation is creating only 7 of these, one for each of the female pilots now documented as having flown combat missions during Desert Storm before the policy change." "It's beautiful," Peg said quietly. "There's more," Reyes continued, reaching into her bag to produce an envelope. "The Chief of Naval Operations has authorized a special ceremony next month at the Pentagon, formally acknowledging the contributions of the Desert Storm 7, as they're being called." Peg opened the envelope, finding a formal invitation along with a detailed program, outlining the recognition planned for each pilot. "I know you've never sought public acknowledgement, Captain," Reyes said, "but this isn't just about personal recognition. It's about the Navy as an institution acknowledging its own history accurately and completely." Peg nodded, recognizing the truth in this perspective. As Reyes prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "There's a rumor circulating that you're being considered for the Naval Aviation Hall of Honor, Captain." Peg shook her head slightly. "The historical accuracy matters more than any personal honors, Commander." "Perhaps," Reyes acknowledged, "but some of us believe that recognizing the pioneers properly inspires the next generation. Midshipman Sophie Lawton, whom you met at the museum. She's been accepted into the flight program with an eye toward fighters. She specifically cited meeting you as a defining moment in solidifying her commitment." The mention of Colonel Lawton's granddaughter brought a smile to Peg's face. History takes unexpected turns, doesn't it? The granddaughter of a man who questioned women in combat roles, now pursuing that very path herself. Progress isn't linear, Reyes agreed. It's full of contradictions and unexpected reconciliations. After Reyes departed, Peg returned to her balcony, the model FA-18 now placed on the table beside her. The evening light caught its polished surface, creating the illusion of a miniature aircraft ready for flight. Peg watched as actual Navy aircraft conducted operations in the distance, their contrails etching temporary patterns against the darkening sky. From this vantage point, the past and present of naval aviation were simultaneously visible, the historical legacy and its continuing evolution. Her place in that continuum had finally been properly acknowledged. The complete story, with all its complexities and contradictions, was preserved for those who would follow. A legacy not of personal glory, but of expanded possibilities for all who followed. Naval Air Station Oceana, Virginia Beach, Virginia, present day. Lieutenant Commander Sophie Lawton completed her pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency, her hands moving through the sequence with the muscle memory developed over thousands of flight hours. The FA-18F Super Hornet responded to her inputs like an extension of her own body, its systems coming online in precisely the expected sequence. Aircraft checks complete, she reported to her weapons systems officer in the rear seat. All systems nominal. Roger that, Skipper, Lieutenant Maria Chen replied. Weapons systems online and functioning normally. Tower, Sunliner 15 requesting clearance for takeoff, Sophie radioed, using the callsign that connected her to generations of naval aviators who had flown with VFA-81 before her. Sunliner 15, you are cleared for takeoff. Winds 040 at 8 knots. Sophie advanced the throttle smoothly, feeling the Super Hornet surge forward as its twin engines propelled it down the runway. The aircraft lifted off cleanly, retracting its landing gear as it climbed into the morning sky. Today's mission was routine by operational standards, a training flight to maintain proficiency in specific combat maneuvers. But for Sophie, it carried additional significance. She would be demonstrating the Callaway method to Maria, showing how the specialized G-force management techniques could optimize performance during high-stress maneuvers. We'll begin with a series of ascending G-loads, Sophie explained, as they reached their designated practice area over the Atlantic. I'll talk you through the modified breathing and muscle engagement sequence as we progress. Looking forward to it, Skipper, Maria replied. I've studied the theoretical aspects, but experiencing it directly will be valuable. Sophie smiled. Maria, this isn't an evaluation. It's a practical demonstration of techniques that might save your life someday. Feel free to ask questions or provide feedback as we go. I've heard the Callaway method made a significant difference for several pilots in my training class. It did for me, Sophie confirmed. My baseline G tolerance was marginal during initial screening. The standard techniques weren't working effectively. Then my instructor introduced me to these modifications, and suddenly I could handle sustained high G environments without vision loss or other symptoms. What Sophie didn't mention was her personal connection to the method's origins. How she had met Captain Margaret Callaway at the Naval Air Museum. How that encounter had strengthened her determination to pursue fighter aviation, despite her grandfather's historical opposition to women in combat roles. How the complete story of naval aviation's evolution had helped reconcile seemingly contradictory aspects of her family's legacy. Instead, she focused on the practical demonstration, guiding Maria through the specialized breathing patterns and sequential muscle activation techniques as they performed a series of increasingly demanding maneuvers. The key insight, Sophie explained as they recovered from a high-G turn, is that physiological responses aren't uniform across individuals. The Callaway modifications account for broader physiological diversity, something the original training frameworks, developed decades ago with a narrower pool of test subjects, never adequately addressed. It's remarkable that these techniques were developed in actual combat conditions, Maria observed. Most methodologies come from laboratory research, not operational necessity. That's often how the most significant innovations emerge, Sophie replied. From pilots solving practical problems in the cockpit, then passing those solutions to others through informal networks. The formalization comes later, after the techniques prove effective in the field. They continued through the training sequence, gradually increasing the G-loads and complexity of maneuvers. Sophie noted with approval that Maria was implementing the modified techniques effectively, maintaining clear communications even during high-stress segments. That concludes the demonstration sequence, Sophie announced as they leveled out. Questions or observations? The difference is significant, Maria replied thoughtfully. I can maintain much clearer situational awareness using the modified techniques, especially during the sustained high-G segments. That's the practical benefit, Sophie agreed. Better oxygen flow to the brain means better decision-making under stress. In combat, that can make the difference between mission success and failure, between survival and loss. As they turned back toward Oceana, Sophie checked their position and fuel state with automatic precision, the habits of meticulous flight management deeply ingrained after years in the cockpit. You know, Maria said after a moment of companionable silence, my mother was one of the first female FA-18 pilots to deploy with a carrier air wing after the combat exclusion laws were lifted. Lieutenant Commander Jessica Chen. Sophie glanced back toward her WSO with new interest. Chen, any relation to Lieutenant Commander Michelle Chen from the Blue Angels demonstration team? My aunt, Maria confirmed. Both of them trained using the Callaway method. My mother credits it with saving her career. She almost washed out during advanced training until she learned the modified techniques. It's remarkable how these innovations spread through the community, isn't it? Sophie said. Passing from instructor to student, from senior pilot to junior, creating a practical legacy that extends far beyond any individual career. That's what my mother always says, Maria agreed. That the true measure of contribution isn't just personal achievement, but how your innovations and adaptations benefit those who follow. Sophie nodded, thinking of Margaret Callaway and the other pioneering female pilots whose contributions had finally been properly acknowledged and documented. Their legacy wasn't merely historical. It remained present in the techniques used daily throughout naval aviation, in the expanded opportunities available to subsequent generations, in the institutional knowledge that continued to evolve while maintaining its essential connections to the past. As they approached Oceana, Sophie requested landing clearance, guiding the Super Hornet into a textbook approach pattern. Tower Sunliner 15 on final approach, she reported, her voice calm and professional. Sunliner 15 cleared to land runway 27, welcome home. Sophie smiled at the traditional greeting. Home indeed, not just the physical base, but the larger community of naval aviation, with its rich history, its evolving present, and its promising future. A community she was proud to serve, continuing a legacy built by generations of aviators who had pushed boundaries, overcome obstacles, and expanded possibilities through courage, innovation, and determination. As the Super Hornet touched down smoothly on the runway, Sophie reflected on how fortunate she was to be part of that continuing story. A story now documented accurately and completely, With all its complications and contradictions, its successes and failures, its policies and practical realities. A legacy of truth, passed from generation to generation, inspiring those who followed to reach for new heights. A note from the author. If you've read this far, thank you. You gave this story your time, and that means more than I can say. Margaret Peg Calloway is a fictional character, but her story is not entirely fiction. Throughout American history, there have been real women who flew fighter aircraft, who pushed the limits of the human body, who saved their fellow pilots in combat, and who came home to find their names erased from the reports, their call signs replaced with the anonymous phrase, unnamed support element. Their contributions survived not in official documents, but in the quiet passing of knowledge from one cockpit to the next. In techniques named in whispers after women, whose official records showed only what the system chose to acknowledge. I wrote this story for readers like you, those of you who remember in your own ways what it felt like to do the work without receiving the credit, what it felt like to watch your contributions absorbed into institutional practice, attributed to ongoing research or evolved methodology, your name quietly removed from the equation, what it felt like to wait. But Peg's story is also about something deeper. That real legacy doesn't live in official records. It lives in the hands of young pilots practicing a technique their instructor simply called the right way to do it. It lives in a young woman who looks up at the sky and thinks, maybe I can fly that. It lives in every door that was opened, sometimes by policy, sometimes by one person who broke the rules at exactly the right moment, for exactly the right reason. The truth, as Peg always understood, cannot be permanently hidden. It may take 34 years. It may require the courage of the next generation to finally pull it into the light, but it endures. To every reader who has ever done something exceptional and watched someone else take the bow, this story is for you. Thank you for being here.